Introduction to the Logical Investigations, 1900/190 I. Edmund Husserl, 1859–1938, published his Logis Logical Investigations, in 2 volumes in 1900 and 1901.1. The first volume, Prolegomena zur reinen Logik, Prolegomena to Pure Logic, appeared from the publisher Max Niemeyer in July 1900.2. The second volume, subtitled Untersuchungen of Phenomenologie und Theorie der Erkenntnis, Investigations in Phenomenology and the Theory of Knowledge, containing 6 long treatises, or investigations, appeared in 2 parts in 1901. This gargantuan work, which Husserl insisted was not a systematic exposition of logic, ein systematisches Darstellen der Logik, Lee 3, Findlay 2, 3, who 19/I, 228, 3 but an effort at epistemological clarification and critique of the basic concepts of logical knowledge, consisted of a series of analytical inquiries, analytische Untersuchungen, into fundamental issues in epistemology and the philosophy of logic, and also extensive, intricate philosophical discussions of issues in semiotics, semantics, mereology, the study of wholes and parts, formal grammar, the a priori study of the parts of any language whatsoever in regard to their coherent combination into meaningful unities, and the nature of conscious acts, especially presentations and judgments. In fact, it was these latter detailed descriptive psychological analyses of the essential structures of consciousness, in terms of intentional acts, their contents, objects and truth-grasping character, especially in the last 2 investigations, which set the agenda for the emerging discipline Husserl fostered under the name phenomenology. The Prolegomena 4 appeared as a freestanding treatise dedicated to securing the true meaning of logic as a pure, a priori, science of ideal meanings and of the formal laws regulating them, entirely distinct from all psychological acts, contents and procedures. The Prolegomena offered the strongest possible refutation to the then dominant psychologistic interpretation of logic, propounded by John Stuart Mill and others, which Husserl viewed as leading to a skeptical relativism that threatened the very possibility of objective knowledge. Turning instead to an older tradition of logic stemming from Leibniz, Kant, Bolzano and Lotz, Husserl defends a vision of logic as a pure theory of science, in fact, the science of science, in the course of which he carefully elaborates the different senses in which this pure logic can be transformed into a normative science or developed into a practical discipline or technology, Kunstler. The second volume of the Investigations, 1901, was published in 2 parts. Part 1 contained the first 5 investigations and Part 2 the long and dense 6th investigation, the writing of which had considerably delayed the appearance of the work as Husserl began to realize the depth of the phenomenological project he had uncovered. Whereas the Prolegomena was particularly influential in turning the tide against psychologism, Freire's efforts in the same direction being in relative obscurity at the time, it was the second volume of the Investigations in particular that had a major impact on philosophers interested in concrete analyses of problems of consciousness and meaning, leading to the development of phenomenology. Phenomenology, in line with the general turn away from idealism then current, was to be a science of concrete issues. According to Husserl's introduction, phenomenology aimed to avoid speculative constructions in philosophy, exemplified, in his view, by Hegel. The Investigations impressed its early readers as exemplifying a radically new way of doing philosophy, focusing directly on analysis of the things themselves, the matters at issue, die Sachen selbst, without the usual detour through the history of philosophy, merely criticizing traditional philosophemes as Husserl put it, Lee 6, Intro, Findlay 2, 187, who are 19/2, 543, or making partisan declarations in favor of some philosophical system, such as empiricism, positivism, rationalism, Hegelianism or Neo-Kantianism. Within a decade, as Husserl's groundbreaking efforts came to be recognized, the Investigations had established itself as the foundational text of the nascent phenomenological movement, a term Husserl himself regularly invoked, in Germany. The Investigations' influence subsequently spread throughout Europe, from Russia and Poland to France and Spain, such that eventually, it is no exaggeration to say that this work took on a status in 20th century European philosophy analogous to that of another foundational text, this time in psychoanalysis, Die Traumdeutung, Interpretation of Dreams, 5 published by Husserl's contemporary Sigmund Freud, 1856–1939, in 1899. The Investigations continues to be a necessary starting point for anyone wanting to understand the development of European philosophy in the 20th century, from Heidegger and Freud to Levinas, Gadamer, Sartre or Derrida. Given that the Logical Investigations is such a pivotal text in 20th century philosophy, it remains something of a neglected masterpiece, remarkably little read, and where read, poorly understood. For some 70 years it remained untranslated into English. An American philosopher living in Europe, William B. Pickens sought Husserl's permission to translate it into English in 1905, but he abandoned the effort when he could not get a publisher. See who XVL, XXE, 19/1, XG. Seemingly, the philosopher William James, who was consulted on the project, advised the publisher not to proceed, suggesting that the last thing the world needed was another German textbook on logic, and so the project was abandoned, which grieved Husserl because he had been an admirer of James. 6 Marvin Faber, an American student of Husserl's, published a paraphrase of the Investigations in 1943-7, but it was not until 1970 that John N. Findlay produced the first and only complete English translation of the second edition. With the 100th anniversary of the Investigations publication now upon us, it is important to make Findlay's translation available once again in an accessible form for the English-speaking reader. The emergence of phenomenology in the first edition of 1901, Husserl adopted the existing term phenomenology, a term already in currency since Lambert, Kant and Hegel, but given new vigor by Brentano and his students, in a somewhat less than fully systematic way to characterize his new approach to the conditions of the possibility of knowledge in general. Husserl wrote in his introduction, pure phenomenology represents a field of neutral researches, in which several sciences have their roots. It is, on the one hand, an ancillary to psychology conceived as an empirical science. Proceeding in purely intuitive fashion, it analyzes and describes in their essential generality, in the specific guise of a phenomenology of thought and knowledge, the experiences of presentation, judgment and knowledge, experiences which, treated as classes of real events in the natural context of zoological reality, receive a scientific probing at the hands of empirical psychology. Phenomenology, on the other hand, lays bare the sources from which the basic concepts and ideal laws of pure logic flow, and back to which they must once more be traced, so as to give them all the clearness and distinctness needed for an understanding, and for an epistemological critique, of pure logic. Lee, Findlay I, 166, who are 19/I, 6–7. The logician is not interested in mental acts as such, but only in objective meanings and their formal regulation. The phenomenologist on the other hand is concerned with the essential structures of cognition and their essential correlation to the things known. When Husserl says in this introduction, we must go back to the things themselves, wir wollen auf die Sachen se/BSTs or ich Lee, Findlay I, 168, who are 19/1, 10. He means particularly that the task of phenomenology is to clarify the nature of logical concepts by tracing their origins in intuition. Our great task is now to bring the ideas of logic, the logical concepts and laws, die logischen Stehen, Begriffe und Gesetze, to epistemological clarity and definiteness. Here phenomenological analysis must begin. Lee, Findlay I, 168, who are 19/1. More broadly, Husserl wants to document all matters that present themselves to consciousness in their diverse modes of intuitive givenness, and not restricting the sources of intuition arbitrarily in advance, as empiricism and other theories traditionally had done. Husserl initially characterized phenomenology ambiguously as either a parallel discipline to epistemology, or as a more radical grounding of epistemology, that sought to clarify the essences of acts of cognition in their most general sense. In analyzing knowledge, Husserl wanted to do justice both to the necessary ideality, that is, self-identity and independence of space and time, of the truths known in cognition, and at the same time properly recognize the essential contribution of the knowing acts of the subject. Thus, looking back in 1925, Husserl described the aim of the logical investigations as follows. In the year 1900-01 appeared my logical investigations, which were the results of my 10-year-long efforts to clarify the idea of pure logic by going back to the sense-bestowing or cognitive achievements being effected in the complex of lived experiences of logical thinking. 8 Husserl's overall aim is to lay down what he describes as the phenomenological founding of logic, Die Phänomenologische Fundia under Logic, Lee, Findlay I, 175, who are 19/1. 22, a clarification of the essential nature of logical knowledge as a preliminary to systematic formal logic and to science in general. 9 More narrowly, his phenomenology of the logical experiences, Phenomenologie der logischen Erlebnis, Lee, Findlay I, 168, who are 19/1. 10, aims to give descriptive understanding of the mental states and their indwelling senses, Einwohnenden with the aim of fixing the meanings of key logical concepts and operations, through elaborate and careful distinctions and clarifications. Phenomenology, in the first edition, then, meant the efforts to inquire, radically and consistently, back from the categories of objectivities to the subjective acts, act structures, experimental foundations in which the objectivities of the appropriate sorts come to be objects of consciousness and to evident self-givenness, working in the domain of pure intuition, rather than being a theoretical or hypothetical construction in the manner of naturalistic psychology. As Husserl put it in 1925, this regressive inquiry brings a new world to light. 10. This is the domain of the correlation between objectivity and subjectivity. In particular, Husserl wants carefully to analyze the intentional subject matter of expressive experiences, Ausdrucke Erlebnis, where expression is understood as the articulating of meaning. His focus then is on the ideal sense of the objective intention, intentionale Gehold, der Ideen ihre Gegenstehen liegen Intention, Lee, Findlay I, 174, who are 19/21. In giving an account of the idea of meaning or expression, Husserl takes concepts apart and elaborates extensively on their many meanings before moving on to discuss other related concepts. Thus, for example, he carefully distinguishes the number of different senses of the term presentation, Vorstellung, separating out its various psychological, logical and epistemological meanings. Likewise, he embarks on conceptual analyses of key concepts such as content, judgment and consciousness. Thus he recognizes the need to sort out the many meanings of the term content, /hold, sometimes Gehold, a term particularly frequently invoked by logicians and psychologists of the day. In particular, the contrast between what Husserl terms in the first edition real, and ideal content, and later what he refers to as the distinction between phenomenological and intentional content, Liv 16. A typical example of the clarification Husserl is seeking is his differentiation in Sixth Investigation, 30-5, of the kinds of unity and conflict of meaning contents that lay the basis for the logical laws of consistency and contradiction. It is these rigorous feats of analysis that won the admiration of early readers and, more recently, of analytic philosophers. While Husserl's own concrete analyses were initially focused primarily on the foundations of arithmetic and logic, and the structures of knowledge, gradually he and his followers broadened phenomenology to address the a priori structures of consciousness in general, including affective, volitional, practical, evaluative, aesthetic, religious, legal, political and other forms of conscious awareness of meaning grasping and meaning articulating. Phenomenology was to be a science of essences and as such it was a priori discipline, attending to the nature of things as given in essential seeing, Wohlsens. Phenomenology would broaden the sources of intuition further than previous philosophers had allowed, and clarify the fundamental relation of thought to truth. Quite early on, the investigations attracted the attention of students of the Munich philosopher and psychologist Theodor Lupps, 1851-1914, who himself had been criticized for psychologism in the Prolegomena and who, in consequence, altered his views to come largely into agreement with Husserl. Through Lupps's students, especially Johannes Dorbert, 1877-1947, the logical investigations became the leading philosophical text for a generation of German philosophers, including Alexander Pfander, I-870-1941, whose prize-winning, habilitation thesis, written under Lupps at Munich, Phenomenology of Willing. A psychological analysis, Phenomenologie des Wollens. Ein Psycho/Analyse, 1900, contained the word phenomenology in the title, although the term does not occur elsewhere in the work. 11 Subsequently, Max Scheler, 1874-1928, Adolf Reinach, 1883-1917, Edith Stein, 1891-1942, and Roman Uniden, 1893-1970, were all drawn to this early conception of phenomenology with its strongly realist orientation and its promise of resolving philosophy's hitherto intractable disputes. The role of the investigations in Husserl's development. Husserl himself regarded his logical investigations as a breakthrough, not an end but rather a beginning. Ein Werk des Durchbruchs, somit nicht ein Ende, sondern ein Anfang, Lee Findlay I, 3, who 12 in it. Husserl abandoned his earlier approaches to logic and mathematics expressed in his first book, Philosophie der Arithmetik, Philosophy of Arithmetic, 1891, 13, which had been judged psychologistic by its chief critic, Gottlob Frege, 1848-1925. Husserl discovered a much more fruitful way of doing philosophy in a rigorously scientific way through the clarification of the essences of our fundamental cognitive achievements, eventually leading to his later transformation of phenomenology into a comprehensive transcendental philosophical outlook. Ever a restless innovator, he constantly reinterpreted the significance of his own contribution, and thus the investigations played a singular role in his own philosophical development. Both in his lecture courses and in his private research manuscripts, he constantly reworked the ground covered in the logical investigations, for example, in his Göttingen lectures on logic, 1906-7, on meaning, 1907-8, on logic, 1910-11, in his Freiburg lectures on logic and in phenomenological psychology, 1925, in the lectures that eventually evolved into formal and transcendental logic, 1929, and even in his Crisis of European Sciences, 1936, and the posthumously published Experience and Judgment, 1938. Husserl's own breakthrough seemed so surprising even to himself that it had to be constantly rethought. In later years, Husserl sought to distance himself from the common understanding of the work as solely an exercise in the philosophy of logic. He complained that he was being characterized rather limitedly as a logician, whereas he saw himself more broadly as a theorist of science in general, and as the founder of a new foundational science, first philosophy or phenomenology, which aimed at the careful description of all forms of making meaning and registering meaningfulness and hence the whole domain of subjectivity. He even claimed, in a letter to E. Spranger, 1918, quoted in Who 1813, that phenomenology had as little to do with logic as with ethics, aesthetics, and other parallel disciplines. In other words, Husserl would later suggest that it was simply an accident of personal biography that he happened to come to phenomenology through logical researches. He could just as easily have entered the field from another direction entirely. In a letter to Georg Misch of the 16th of November, 1930, Husserl said that he lost interest in formal logic and real ontology when he made his breakthrough to the transcendental, and later concentrated on founding a theory of transcendental subjectivity and intersubjectivity. 14. Before analyzing the investigations in more detail, let us now turn, then, to a brief consideration of the author, Edmund Husserl. Edmund Husserl, 1859–1938. Life and writings. Edmund Husserl was born in Prosnitz, Moravia, now Prostchov, Czech Republic, on the 8th of April, 1859. He studied mathematics and physics at the universities of Leipzig and Berlin, where he was deeply influenced by the mathematician Karl Weierstrass, 1815–97, before moving to the University of Vienna, where he completed his doctorate in mathematics in 1882. Following a brief period as Weierstrass' assistant and a term in the army, Husserl went back to Vienna to study philosophy with Franz Brentano from 1884 to 1886. On Brentano's recommendation, Husserl then went to the University of Halle to study with Brentano's most senior student, Karl Stumpf, 1848–1936, completing his habilitation thesis on the concept of number. Psychological analyses with him in 1887. 15. Husserl remained in Halle as a lowly, unsalaried private docent from 1887 until 1901, the unhappiest years of his life, as he later confessed. Although Husserl wrote research notes and manuscripts continuously and obsessively, he published few books during his lifetime. 16. His first publication at Halle came in 1891 with the Philosophy of Arithmetic, whose opening chapters contained a revised version of his habilitation thesis. The logical investigations took another 10 years of difficult labor to write, during which Husserl sacrificed many of the routines of family life. Husserl always regarded its results as provisional. Nevertheless, writing the book cured him, as he later said to Dorian Kermes. Its publication facilitated a move from Halle to a new salaried position at the University of Göttingen, a renowned center of mathematics under David Hilbert, 1862–1943. It was during his years at Göttingen that he began to attract both German and international students to pursue the practice and theory of phenomenology. However, Husserl still managed only 2 publications between 1901 and 1916, an important long essay, Philosophie als strenge Wissenschaft, Philosophy as a rigorous science, commissioned by Heinrich Ruckert for his new journal Logos in 1910/1911,17, in which Husserl outlined his opposition to all forms of naturalism and historicism, as he understood Dilthus Weltanschauungs's philosophy to be, and a major book, Ideas pertaining to a pure phenomenology and to a phenomenological 5/Ossoff/8. Hereafter Ideas I, published in 1913, which offered an entirely new way of entering into phenomenology. To the great shock of Husserl's earlier realist followers, such as Ingerton and Fander, Ideas I quite deliberately espoused a form of transcendental idealism, involving a radicalization of the projects of Kant and Descartes, an outlook Husserl would continue to maintain and develop throughout his career. Husserl himself, however, insisted that he really had this orientation in mind when he was developing phenomenology in the Investigations. In his introduction to Ideas I, he said that readers of the logical investigations had misunderstood the work as an exercise in a kind of immanent psychology, whereas he had always intended a purer and more essential phenomenological approach. In supposed agreement with the logist Untersuchungen, phenomenology has been conceived as a substratum of empirical psychology, as a sphere comprising immanental descriptions of psychical mental processes, a sphere comprising descriptions that, so the immanence in question is understood, are strictly confined within the bounds of internal experience. It would seem that my protest against this conception has been of little avail. Ideas I, 18, who are 3/1, 2. In other words, Husserl would later claim that transcendental phenomenology as a science of pure essential possibilities was entirely distinct from psychology in all its forms, including descriptive psychology, which he now treats as a branch of empirical psychology. In 1916, Husserl was appointed to the chair of philosophy at the University of Freiburg, which he held until his retirement in 1928. Here, as he recorded in his 1924 work to the revision of the Sixth Investigation, Lee, Findlay 1970, 661, who are 19/2, 533, he became deeply immersed in teaching and research, pursuing the ideal of a system of philosophy with phenomenology at its core, and published almost nothing, apart from an article on the renewal of philosophy in a Japanese journal Kaizo, a little article on Buddha, and a truncated version of his lectures on time, on the phenomenology of the consciousness of internal time, 1928, edited by his successor to the Freiburg chair, Martin Heidegger, more or less as a counterpoint to the latter's own being and time, 1927. 19. During the last decade of his life, however, Husserl was extremely active, giving lectures in Germany, Holland and France, and publishing Formal and Transcendental Logic in 1929-20 and the French version of his Paris lectures, Meditations Cartesiennes, in 1931, translated by Gabriel Peffer and Emmanuel Levinas. 21. In part, Husserl's intense activity was spurred by his desire to offer a corrective to Heidegger's version of phenomenological ontology, which Husserl felt distorted and betrayed his own mission for a transcendental phenomenology. Following the coming to power of the National Socialists in January 1933, Husserl and his family suffered under the increasingly severe anti-Semitic laws enacted in Germany, which led to the suspension of his emeritus rights and eventually, in 1935, to the withdrawal of German citizenship. While he continued to live in Freiburg, he was shunned by most of his former colleagues, apart from his assistant Eugen Fink, 1905–75, and former student Ludwig Landgrebe, by then a professor in Prague. However, he set about the task of preparing his extensive research manuscripts for publication. Despite meeting with official opposition, Husserl continued to write with new vigor against the crisis of the age, producing work of astonishing scope and originality. For example, The Crisis of European Sciences, developed in lectures in Vienna and Prague and published in Belgrade in 1936, publication in Germany being denied him. 22. After a period of illness, Husserl died in Freiburg in 1938. His last work, Erfahrung und Urteil, Experience and Judgment, appeared posthumously, with the extensive editorial involvement of Ludwig Landgrebe, in 1938.23 through the intervention of a young Belgian philosophy graduate and priest, Fr. Herman van Breda, 1911–74. Much of Husserl's Nachlass, including lecture notes and research manuscripts, amounting to some 45,000 pages of handwritten material, composed in an obsolete German shorthand, the Gabelsberger system, was smuggled out of Nazi Germany and is now preserved in manuscript form in the Husserl Archives in Leuven, Belgium. Here, in cooperation with the sister archives in Cologne and Freiburg, researchers are carefully editing these manuscripts for publication in the Husserl Energy Samelt work series, of which more than 30 volumes have already appeared, with more scheduled. The genesis of the logical investigations. On his own admission, the origin of Husserl's logical investigations lay in the studies in mathematics, logic and psychology he had been pursuing, inspired by his teachers Weierstrass, Brentano and Stumpf. As he put it, the investigations originally grew out of his desire to achieve a philosophical clarification, ein Philosophist hier Rang, of pure mathematics, Findlay I. L. who 18.5. It worried Husserl that mathematicians could produce good results and yet employ diverse and even conflicting theories about the nature of numbers and other mathematical operations. Their intuitive procedures needed philosophical grounding. In search of this grounding for mathematics, Husserl was led to consider formal systems generally, and ultimately to a review of the whole nature of meaningful thought, its connection with linguistic assertion, and its achievement of truth in genuinely evident cognitions. Husserl suggested that the logical investigations was originally inspired by Brentano's attempts to reform traditional logic. As he put it in his Phenomenological Psychology lectures of 1925, the logical investigations are fully influenced by Brentano's suggestions, as should be readily understandable in view of the fact that I was a direct pupil of Brentano. 24 In lecture courses Husserl had attended, Brentano had proposed a reform of traditional Aristotelian syllogistic logic, restricting the range of significant logical forms, effectively reducing all forms of quantification to existential quantification, reformulating the structure of logical judgments and recasting sentences in new ways to highlight the underlying logical structure distinct from the grammatical form. Despite its promise, Husserl recognized that Brentano's project was destined to fail, since it lacked a proper clarification of the nature of meaning in general. Only a complete clarification of the essential phenomenological relations between expression and meaning, or between meaning intention and meaning fulfillment, Findlay I. 173, who 19/I, could steer the proper course between grammatical analysis and meaning analysis, Bedutancenalis, Husserl claimed. Brentano's failed reform of logic alerted Husserl's attention to serious deficiencies in current accounts of the nature of logic, in J. S. Mill, C. Sigwart, W. Hamilton, B. Erdmann, T. Lopes, and others. Husserl's familiarity with, and deep critique of, the logical and mathematical developments of the 19th century are evident in his several critical reviews of logical literature, published in 1894, 1897, 1903 and 1904.25. While he fully recognized the importance of logic understood as a calculus of classes being developed by George Boole, 1815-64, and by his German contemporary, Ernst Schroeder, and the attempts to interpret logical deduction as a mechanical process made by William Stanley Jevons, L. 835-82, and others, including Gottlob Frege, Husserl harbored worries about the limitations of formal mathematical logic, which he saw as a refinement of logical technique rather than as a genuine philosophy of logic. 26 In particular, Husserl saw a calculus purely as a formal device for mechanically transposing signs, or replacing them with equivalents, according to rules, and thus essentially different from proper logical deduction. Technical brilliance in mathematical logic still required critical theoretical insight in order to elevate it to science. For a more positive view of logic, Husserl revived pure logic, a conception deriving from Leibniz and Kant, but expressed most clearly in the Wissenschaftslehre of the neglected Austrian logician Bernard Bolzano, 1781-1848, 27, and his followers, especially Frege's teacher Rudolf Hermann Lotz, 1817-81, which saw logic as a purely formal science of science. Husserl singled out Bolzano in particular as one of the greatest logicians and even as the unacknowledged forefather of modern mathematical logic. Logic as a science must be built upon Bolzano's work, and must learn from him its need for mathematical acuteness in distinctions, for mathematical exactness in theories. It will then reach a new standpoint for judging the mathematicizing theories of logic, which mathematicians, quite unperturbed by philosophic scorn, are so successfully constructing. These theories altogether conform to the spirit of Bolzano's logic, though Bolzano had no inkling of them. Lee, Professor 61, Findlay I. 143, who 228. Husserl would also credit Hermann Lotz with opening his eyes to the true nature of the ideal objectivities which logic studied, helping him to understand the domain of the ideal while avoiding Platonic hypostasization. Of course, as Husserl set out to write the logical investigations, many other philosophical issues pressed on him, leading him considerably beyond what might be considered to belong strictly to the task of laying the foundations of logic and into broader questions of epistemology, semantics and even ontology. Husserl was drawn to inquire into the conditions of meaningful utterance and expression generally, beginning with the nature of signification in general, linguistic expression, the relation between individual and species, the a priori laws governing the whole part structures generally, the formal laws governing linguistic sense and nonsense, the puzzling nature of intentional content and reference, and, finally, the nature and structure of conscious acts as such, and specifically the nature and structure of judgments which aim at truth and which were traditionally considered to be the vehicles of logical thought. These themes make up the 6 investigations of the second volume. Husserl struggled to rescue logic from psychology. As Husserl acknowledged in the foreword to the investigations, his philosophical career began from Brentano's assumption that logical issues could only be clarified by psychology. However, his initial attempts at laying a psychological foundation, Psychologische Fundierung, Lee, Findlay I. 2, who 6, for arithmetical and logical concepts and judgments quickly ran into problems. While psychology was undeniably useful for clarifying the practical procedures of human reasoning and in accounting for the origins of concepts, it failed completely to appreciate or handle the logical unity of the thought content. Denkin-Holt, Findlay I. 2, who 6, involved, specifically, the complete independence of this content from all our psychical behavior. The Pythagorean theorem stands as an independent valid truth whether anyone actually thinks it or not. Such thought contents possess an ideality that allow them to be instantiated in different thought processes of the same individual. Lee, Intro. 2. Findlay I. 167, who are 19/1, 8, or in diverse individuals' thoughts at different times. Psychological analysis could not accommodate this peculiar ideal unity of thought contents. Husserl therefore suspended his investigations into the philosophy of mathematics to grapple with the fundamental epistemological questions, Die Grundfrage der Erkenntnis Theory, Findlay I. 2, who 7, thrown up by his recognition of the ideality of meanings. Mathematics and logic needed a thorough epistemological grounding, through a critique of knowledge, Erkenntnisskritik, to be carried out through the application of phenomenological essential insight, as Husserl would develop it. In the investigations, then, Husserl aims at the very idea, of meaning and the idea of knowledge, the systematic conception of the essence of meaning and knowledge, which had been completely obscured in the psychologistic approach. He employed the term phenomenology to express this kind of fundamental epistemological inquiry, see Lee Intro. 7, which looked at the very structure of acts of thinking and knowing as well as at the objects of knowledge in terms of their essential meanings. Inspired by his intensive reading of Bolzano, Lotz and other logicians, and of contemporary Brentanians such as Casimir Twardowski, 1866-1938, Alois Hoefler, 1853-1922, and Alexius Meinong, 1853-1920, Husserl came to question the idea of psychological grounding. Husserl came to reject the account in the philosophy of arithmetic of the genesis of arithmetic concepts as given which employed Brentanian descriptive psychology to trace the psychological genesis of numbers in acts of collecting and colligating. His much discussed interaction with the logician Gottlob Frege in the early 1890s may also have helped to accelerate the shift that was already occurring in his thinking. 28. It is at least clear that both philosophers separately were developing sophisticated accounts of the difference between the sense, shin, of an expression and its objective reference. In Husserl's case, this distinction would deepen his understanding of the structure of the intentional relation, leading ultimately to his breakthrough recognition of the essential correlation between thinking and its object, which he says occurred around 1898.29. From the outset of his career, Husserl had regarded Brentano's rediscovery of intentionality, the aboutness or directedness of mental acts, as hugely significant for the analysis of cognitive acts and processes, which Husserl called erlebnis, lived experiences or mental processes, but, during the 1890s, he came to reject as unsatisfactory Brentano's account, which seemed embedded in Cartesian immanentist assumptions about the nature of ideas, and which left dangling the issue of the status of intentional objects. Husserl was dissatisfied with Brentano's characterization of the intentional object as inexistent and as indwelling in the act. This characterization seemed to repeat the impasse of the modern representationalist account of knowledge in Locke and others, with its attendant problem of the ability of the mind to get beyond its own representations. Brentano had maintained that every presentation related to an object, but what about presentation that appeared to have no objects? Bolzano had discussed objectless presentations, and the problem of the status of thoughts that involved impossible or non-actual entities, round squares, golden mountains, and so on, had been bequeathed to Brentano's pupils, especially Twardowski and Meinong. Do all thoughts refer to objects, even thoughts of impossible objects? In a number of studies throughout the 1890s, Husserl carefully clarified his own understanding of the relations between the intentional act, its content and object, in, for example, his fragments discussing the differences between intuition, Ansporung, and representation, representation, in terms of the kind of fulfillment, Erfüllung, involved 30 in his draft review of Twardowski's book on the content and object of presentations 31 and in the several drafts of his never completed study. Intentional Gegenstände, intentional objects, probably written in 1894 and reworked up to 1898.32. The results of these investigations found their way into the second volume of the investigations, especially the first and fifth investigations and the appendix to the sixth investigation, where the issue of intentionality and Husserl's distance from Brentano's conception of inner perception are treated at some length. Briefly, Husserl rejected Brentano's attempts to define psychical phenomena in distinction from physical phenomena and his account of immanent objectivity. For Husserl, the main achievement of Brentano was that he identified the essential pointing beyond itself, Übersicht hinausweisen, of the mental act. Twardowski's attempt to distinguish between the sensuous immanent content of the act's intentional object, and the real object referred to, also suffered from a false duplication of the object. 33. Husserl's answer was to distinguish between the immanent sensuous real contents of the mental act and the transcendent ideal meaning content of the act, which guarantees we are speaking of the same meaning across repeated acts, and between these and the transcendent object of the act, and not as Twardowski considered it the immanent object. 34. By the late 1890s, Husserl had developed the main elements of his account of the relations between signs and things signified, between intentions and their intuitive fulfillments, but it seems likely that his crucial distinction between sensuous acts and acts of categorical intuition did not emerge until he began writing the 6 investigations themselves. This notion of categorical intuition, a distinct intuition of complexes founded on sensory intuition, opened up the proper domain of phenomenological viewing as Husserl would develop it after 1901. The results of Husserl's intensive research during his most active decade of the 1890s were brought together in a remarkable way in the investigations. Thus, for instance, his 1894 article, Psychologists studieren the Elemente in Logic, Psychological Studies in the Elements of Logic, 35 sketched the distinction between dependent and independent contents that inaugurated the theory of parts and wholes later incorporated into the third investigation. But the first real start on writing the investigations came in 1896 when Husserl delivered the lectures that formed the basis of the Prolegomena, and in 1899 began to prepare the 6 investigations themselves for the press. There is some evidence, chiefly his wife Malvine's account, that Husserl was still feverishly revising when the manuscript was wrested from his hands by Stumpf and sent to the publisher. 36. Certainly, it is clear that Husserl was having difficulties containing the 6th investigation as it grew in length and complexity and forced him to rethink distinctions made in the earlier investigations, including his account of the relation between demonstrative indication and fulfillment of meaning in cases of perception. The published revisions of the Logical Investigations, 1913, 1921, almost as soon as the first edition of the Logical Investigations appeared, Husserl began to express dissatisfaction with some of its formulations and began to revise. In his 190 2/3 lectures on epistemology, he was already clarifying the distinction between phenomenology, which he characterizes as a pure theory of essences, Rainer Wissenslehr, and descriptive psychology. 37. But his first public opportunities came in 1903, with his reply to a critic named Melchior Palagi. 38, where he made clear that his concept of ideality was drawn from Hermann Lotz, and that he was not opposed to the psychological explanation of concepts but only to the founding of logic. Upon such an explanation, and with his Bericht über deutsche Schriften zur Logik in den Jahren 1895 to 1899, report on German writings in logic from the years 1895-1899, where he repudiated his initial characterization of the work as a set of investigations in descriptive psychology. 39 From around 1905, as is evident from letters written to Schuler and others, Husserl clearly intended to publish a revised edition of the investigations, see Hu 19/1, 23. In subsequent lecture courses at Göttingen, for example, in 1906-7,40, 1907-8,41 and 1910-11,42, Husserl developed new conceptions of logic, semiotics, and semantics, including the theory of the forms of meanings begun in the 4th investigation, but which needed to be revised in the light of the 6th, offering essential revising of aspects of the earlier tentative formulations, and leading ultimately to an entirely new theory of phenomenological meaning, publicly announced as the doctrine of the noema in ideas I. Also, from around 1905 and inspired by his reading of Kant and Descartes, Husserl was moving in a transcendental direction, embracing both Descartes' project of prima philosophia, first philosophy, and Kant's project of a critique of reason. 43 Husserl was revising his thoughts on the nature of the flow of consciousness and on the conception of the pure ego, which he had repudiated as an unnecessary postulate in the first edition, where he was satisfied with the empirical ego. He gradually came to see the need for a fundamental change of attitude, Einstellungsänderung, away from the natural attitude as a prerequisite for the proper phenomenological seeing of the essences of cognitive acts, noetic acts in general, and their objects understood as pure possibilities of any consciousness whatsoever. This reorientation shed new light on the correlation between the intentional act and its object, understood as what is intended in the manner in which it is intended, a conception that eventually would be named as the noema, which made its first published appearance in Ideas I. As Husserl engaged in this self-criticism and reorientation, the problem of relating these new concepts of phenomenology to his existing published work became evident. Around 1911, with the first edition of the Investigations now out of print, and with misinterpretations gaining currency among his followers, Husserl began to think seriously about revising the whole work in the light of a new introduction to phenomenology and transcendental philosophy which he was planning, and which eventually appeared as Ideas I. 1913. 44 At first, Husserl harbored ambitious plans to offer a number of new expositions of phenomenology and phenomenological philosophy that would render the old investigations obsolete. See his letter of the 7th of July 1912 to W. E. Hocking, quoted in Hua 19/1. XXV. However, since Ideas I was a deliberately programmatic work, to complement it Husserl saw the need for examples of concrete phenomenological analyses, attempts at genuinely executed fundamental work on the immediately envisaged and seized things themselves. Versuch wirklich ausführende fundamentalarbeieten unmittelbar Erschöpfung Griffen and Sachen, Findlay I, 4, Hua 18:9, as he puts it in the foreword to the second edition. The 6 investigations would remain the paradigm of these concrete phenomenological inquiries. Husserl began revising the text of the logical investigations in March 1911, but only made real progress in spring 1913 after Ideas I went to press. However, even his relatively modest planned revision, done in the light of his new understanding of phenomenology, as expressed in Ideas I, proved too demanding, and he produced only a partially revised second edition in 1913.45. This was Husserl's middle course, Mittelweg, as he put it in his foreword to the second edition, where he articulated 3 maxims that guided the revision, Findlay I, 4-5, Hua 18, 10-11, namely, to leave individual errors standing as representing steps in his own path of thinking, to improve what could be improved, without altering the course and style of the original, to lift the reader level by level to newer and deeper insights. In the revision the prolegomena, which was written with a single purpose, was left largely unchanged, but those passages in the investigations that specifically discussed the nature of phenomenology, and the kind of essential insight involved, were extensively altered and expanded. In general, the second edition highlights the central discovery of phenomenology, a concept that had received only tangential and incidental treatment in the first edition, and gives surer indications about its nature. Thus, invoking his 1903 essay, quoted in foreword to the second edition, Findlay I, 6, Hua 18:13, Husserl claims that the chief error of the 1901 edition was to call phenomenology a descriptive psychology, whereas in fact, phenomenology knows nothing of personal experiences, of a self, or of others. Similarly, it neither sets itself questions, nor answers them, nor makes hypotheses. In 1903, Husserl had claimed that this purely immanent phenomenology was to be free of all suppositions about the nature of the psychological, and furthermore, it would actually provide a critique of knowledge that might then be used as a basis for empirical psychology or other sciences. But, in itself, phenomenology is not identical with descriptive psychology. 46 This phenomenological approach brings to evidence the general essences of the concepts and laws of logic. While both descriptive psychology and phenomenology are a priori disciplines, phenomenology cuts all its ties with individual minds and real psychic processes, even those understood in the most exemplary manner. Lee, Intro. 3. Findlay I, 171, Hua 19/1, 16, added in the second edition. Husserl is now more emphatic that this eidetic science relies entirely on the evidence of pure intuition, and operates within the sphere of immanence, bracketing all concerns with worldly existence and real psychological processes. Husserl thus imports into the text of the investigations the notions of bracketing, epoche, and reduction, which had become central to his expositions of phenomenology only after 1905.47. Husserl now stresses the remoteness and unnaturalness of phenomenological reflection and expands the section, Lee, Intro. 3. Devoted to listing various difficulties that attach to how we move from naive to reflexive understanding. Pure phenomenological seeing, or sense show, must be purged of its inherent world-positing tendency and associated beliefs that belong to what Husserl calls the natural attitude, die Natureinstellung, with its assumption of real existence, Empiris reales Dasein, Seeliv 2, Findlay 2, 82, Hua 19/1, 357, paragraph added in the second edition. It was this purification of epistemology from the distortions imposed by the natural attitude that led Husserl to see phenomenology as essentially distinct from any psychology, including descriptive psychology. Instead, phenomenology was to be the universal science of pure consciousness. 48 Husserl later stressed that the first edition was already de facto analyses of essence, but that he gradually came to clearer self-consciousness regarding the purely eidetic nature of his inquiries. 49 The revisions of the second edition constantly underscore the pure a priori, eidetic character of phenomenology. Consider the following typical revision to the third investigation. The original sentence in the first edition, referring to the relations of dependence holding between quality and intensity of a tone, reads, and this is not a mere fact but a necessity. The second edition reworks this sentence to read, evidently this is no mere empirical fact, but an a priori necessity, grounded in pure essence. Lee 3-4, Findlay 2, 18, Hua 19/I, 237. The pure a priori essential character of the laws uncovered by phenomenological insight is now sharply contrasted with the kind of empirical generalization characteristic of the natural sciences. To clarify this further, Husserl replaced section 12 of the third investigation, Lee 3-12, which had dealt with dependence relations between temporally coexisting and successive parts, with a completely rewritten section in the second edition, which specifies more exactly the nature of the distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions, whereby analytic propositions are purely formal and are not determined by their content in any way, whereas a priori laws which relate to contents are synthetic a priori. Phenomenology focuses on the essential features of conscious states in general, akin to Kant's concern with knowledge in general, Erkenntnis überhaupt, a conception already elaborated in the first edition, understood as pure possibilities rather than in terms of any empirical instantiation in animals, humans or other kinds of minds. In contrast with pure phenomenology, Husserl now more sharply characterizes all psychology as empirical, as a causal science of physical organisms and their psychophysical states, for example, as the empirical science of the mental attributes and states of animal realities, als Erfahrungswissenschaft von psychischen Eigenschaften und Zuständen animalischer Realitäten, Lee, Intro 2, Findlay I, 169, Hua 19/I, 12, the science which studies the real states of animal organisms in a real natural order, Lee Intro 6, Findlay I, 176, Hua 19/I, 23. Husserl distinguishes both empirical and its sub-branch descriptive psychology from pure phenomenology. While psychology is a valuable empirical science, the reduction of meanings to their psychological states, i.e., psychologism, is a natural, ever-present temptation to the mind, at first inevitable, since rooted in grounds of essence. Lee, Intro 2, Findlay I, 169, Hua 19/I, 12, which can only be cured by phenomenological analysis. Only pure phenomenology, and not descriptive psychology, Husserl writes in the second edition, can overcome psychologism. Lee, Intro 2, Findlay I, 169, Hua 19/I, 11-12. Furthermore, Husserl departs from Neo-Kantianism, by stressing that the grasp of the conditions for the possibility of knowledge comes from insight into the essence of knowledge, that is from phenomenological viewing. In keeping with his new transcendental orientation, Husserl has more appreciation in the second edition of the pure ego, Das Reine/ch, Liv 5, 8, of the Neo-Kantians, especially Natorp, which he had originally dismissed as an unnecessary postulate for the unification of consciousness. See Liv 8, Findlay 2, 352, Hua 19/I, 374. He also endeavors to improve his initial attempts at drawing a distinction between the quality and intentional matter of acts. In particular, he was unhappy with his original characterization of the sensuous matter of the act and the manner in which it is taken up and interpreted in the act. His later account of the noema was offered as a corrective. See, for example, Liv. 16, Findlay 2, 354, who are 19/I, 411. In the first edition, Husserl had characterized phenomenology as expanding or as clarifying epistemology, for example, Lee Intro Findlay I, 166, 2, I, 168, in that it offered a kind of conceptual analysis, Begriffsanalyse, concerned with differentiating and disambiguating the different senses of basic epistemological concepts, such as presentation, Vorstellung. In his introduction to the second edition, Husserl is now more aware of a possible misunderstanding whereby this conceptual analysis would be misunderstood purely as an investigation of language, in short as linguistic analysis, whereas in fact Husserl is anxious to distinguish his analytical phenomenology from linguistic analysis. Reliance on language can be misleading, Husserl believes, because linguistic terms have their home in the natural attitude, in der natürlichen Stellung, and may mislead about the essential character of the concepts they express, whereas phenomenological thinking about consciousness takes place in the eidetic realm where all natural attitudes are bracketed. For Husserl, it is certainly true that the objects of logic, propositions or statements, sits, are encountered only in their grammatical clothing, i.e., in linguistic assertions, and it is an obvious fact that the findings of science eventually take the form of linguistic utterances or sentences. Husserl, then, agrees with J.S. Mill that discussions of logic must begin with a consideration of language, though not issues of the nature of grammar or the historical evolution of language as such, but rather in relation to a theory of knowledge. Husserl is seeking a pure phenomenology of the experiences of thinking and knowing. Findlay I, 166, who are 19/I, 6. Experience is not to be understood as empirical facts, but rather grasped in the pure generality of their essence, Ibid. Linguistic analysis is not a substitute for a fundamental analysis of consciousness, see Lee I 21. In this sense, phenomenology clarifies our linguistic practice and not the other way round. Husserl's incomplete revisions of the Sixth Investigation in 1913. Husserl intended to revise the Sixth Investigation in a radical fashion, but became bogged down. See his letter of the 23rd of June, 1913 to Dorbert, quoted in Who 19/I, XXV, and eventually withheld it when he sent the revised 5 investigations to press. Husserl now recognized that his original account of categorical intuition with its realist commitments did not fit comfortably with his new transcendental idealist framework. He made various attempts at a complete reworking of this investigation in late 1913 and again in 1914, but lost enthusiasm for these revisions during the war years, 1914-18, when exhaustion prevented research on behalf of the phenomenology of logic, für die Phänomenologie des Logischen, Findlay 2, 177, who are 19/2, 533. As he recounted, he could only bear the war and the ensuing peace by engaging in more general philosophical reflections, specifically the elaboration of his idea of a phenomenological philosophy, / die eine phenomenologische Philosophy, Findlay 2, 177, who are 19/2, 533. Meanwhile, he gave the manuscripts to Edith Stein, who attempted to order them into 2 articles for the Jahrbuch, but she could not get Husserl to look over her work and the project stalled. After the war, Husserl turned again to logic and eventually was prevailed upon to publish a limited revision of the Sixth Investigation in spring 1921. In his foreword, dated Freiburg, October, 1920, Husserl regrets that he was unable to produce the radically revised Sixth Investigation promised in 1913, and acknowledges that it was the pressure of friends, including, presumably, his new assistant Martin Heidegger, that finally forced him to produce this new edition. In fact, Husserl was never satisfied with his revision and continued to work intermittently on a full revision of his crucial investigation, leaving some drafts that remained unpublished at his death. 50 These drafts attempt a complete rethinking of the nature of signs involving a distinction between signative and significative intentions in attempting to specify the achievement of abstract symbolic thought. 51 Husserl was also gradually coming to recognize the contextual aspect of meaning which would lead eventually to his discovery of genetic phenomenology in the early 1920s. Husserl's 1920 foreword is written in tones of exasperation and defensiveness regarding the many misunderstandings of his work then current. He details changes made, mainly in the second section of the Sixth Investigation, entitled Sinnlichkeit und Verstand, Sensibility and Understanding, where the concept of categorical intuition, originally introduced in the first investigation, is treated at some length. Husserl maintains that his critics have misunderstood his talk of immediacy as relating to the immediacy of sensory intuition rather than to the nature of intuition generally. In particular, he attacks the views of Friedrich Albert Moritz Schlick, 1882-1936, founder of the Vienna Circle, as expressed in his Allgemeine Erkenntnislehre, General Theory of Knowledge, 1918, 52, where he had argued that Husserl's ideas relied on a bizarre notion of non-physical intuition that required a peculiarly strenuous kind of study. Husserl replies that by strenuous study he means no more than the application of a mathematician. Schlick's criticism typifies a more general unease in philosophical circles with Husserl's emphasis on intuition, which was seen by many as promoting an irrational intuitionism that could not be corrected. The Neo-Kantians voiced similar criticisms of Husserl's concept of categorical intuition, as is evident from Fink's reply to Husserl's critics. 53 How could one have intuition of the categorial? Husserl, on the other hand, understood by intuition, cognitive experiences which are accompanied by adequate evidence. He wants always to emphasize that acts of knowing are essentially diverse and that their respective modes of intuitive fulfillment must be appreciated and appropriately distinguished. In his foreword to the revision of the Sixth Investigation, Husserl also challenges an accusation, apparently widespread, but which he vehemently rejected, that he had rejected psychologism in the first volume of the investigations only to fall back into it in the second. Lee, Findlay 2, 178, who are 19/2, 535. 54 Husserl believes these critics have failed to appreciate the true sense of his phenomenology, and have misunderstood it as a kind of introspectionist psychology. In order completely to separate phenomenology from introspectionism, psychology and indeed all natural sciences, Husserl emphasizes the need to undertake the epoch and the reduction. It was only by removing all traces of the natural attitude in regard to our cognitive achievements that their true essences can come into view in an undistorted manner. This claim integrates the logical investigations into Husserl's later transcendental idealism, whose treatment is beyond the scope of this introduction. Let us now turn to examine in more detail the philosophical content of the work itself. Husserl's Kampfschrift, the Prolegomena. In the foreword to the second edition, Husserl records that the Prolegomena was a polemic on psychologism, Streit um den Psychologismus, Findlay I, 6, who are 18, 12, and major figures such as Paul Natorp, Wilhelm Dilthey and Wilhelm Wundt recognized it as such, so that the Prolegomena took on a life of its own and had an independent impact in German philosophy for its criticism of psychologism. Husserl, however, liked to emphasize its coherence with the second volume and wrote to Meinong that the critique of psychologism was central to his phenomenology of knowledge in general, letter of the 27th of August, 1900, quoted in Who 18, 17. Others, including Wundt, could not so easily see the connection between the two volumes. According to the foreword, the first draft of the Prolegomena originated as two series of lectures delivered at Halle in the summer and autumn of 1896, Findlay I, 5, who 18, 12, and written up in 1899. These 1896 lectures had already set out Husserl's conception of logic as a pure, formal, autonomous science of ideal meanings and the ideal laws which govern them, and offering a sharp differentiation of pure logic from the more traditional interpretation of logic as an art or technique, counsel, of thinking well. The Halle lectures, however, do not contain some of the more important parts of the Prolegomena, namely, the discussion of relativism, Pro. 32-7, and the detailed criticisms of Mill, Spencer, Sigwart and Erdmann, and the discussion of thought economy associated with Mach and Averroes, Pro. 52-6. As the Prolegomena was written entirely in one cast of mind, Husserl did not feel the need to make major revisions in the second edition. Husserl's negative aim was to demonstrate that the psychologistic interpretation of logic was a self-defeating, self-contradictory absurdity. The correctness of the theory presupposes the irrationality of its premises. The correctness of the premise is the irrationality of the theory. Pro/26, Findlay I, 61, who 18, 95. Furthermore, whereas the study of traditional logic should have given a clear understanding of the rational essence of deductive science and indeed be the science of science, in fact the logic of his time was not adequate to that task. Husserl's positive aim was to find out what makes science science. Pro. 62, Findlay I, 144, who 18, 230, but the unclarity and confusion surrounding logical concepts put the whole project of exact scientific knowledge at risk. In no field of knowledge is equivocation more fatal, in none have confused concepts so hindered the progress of Noel-Ge, also impeded insight into its true aims, as in the field F pure logic. Pro. 67, Findlay I, 154, who 18, 246, in his 1900 Selbstanzeige, author's report, to the Prolegomena Husserl announced that he was defending logic as a pure, a priori, independent, theoretical science, reviving the older Bolzanian idea of a pure logic against the prevailing psychologistic misinterpretation of logic that leads to contradictions and absurdities, and ultimately to skeptical relativism. Husserl argues that logical laws and concepts belong to the realm of the ideal, being purely formal, that is, applied in general to every kind of content. In the Prolegomena Husserl makes an important distinction between empirical generalization and the kind of formalization required for idealization in science and mathematics. He contrasts this pure theoretical logic with applied logic, understood as an art of thinking, Kunst, drawing an analogy with the contrast between pure geometry and the art of Landsurveying, Feldmesskunst. Thus, in the Selbstanzeige Husserl defines pure logic as the scientific system of ideal laws and theories which are purely grounded in the sense of the ideal categories of meaning, that is, in the fundamental concepts which are common to all sciences because they determine in the most universal way which makes sciences objective sciences at all, namely, unity of theory. 55 Science as such is for Husserl a regulated interconnection of ideal truths expressed in propositions. Logic deals with these propositions and their component meanings in their utmost generality, understood as pure categories. According to Husserl, following in the Kantian tradition, all logical distinctions are categorial, Lie 2-1, and belong to the pure form of possible objectivities of consciousness as such, Lie 2, Findlay I, 240, who 19/I, 115. Furthermore, knowledge can be about many kinds of different things. There are multifarious objects of knowledge, not just real things, but ideal entities, relations, events, values. The conception of scientific knowledge must be sufficiently broad to accommodate this diversity of objects of knowledge. Husserl, then, wants a new account of logic as a pure a priori science, a mathesis universalis in the manner of Leibniz. It must be balanced with a new theory of the nature of objects in general, formal ontology, developed in the third investigation. In other words, pure logic has a counterpart, the pure theory of objects. Husserl's encounter with Frege, the issue of psychologism since the rejection of psychologism and the defense of the ideal objectivity of logical laws is now more usually credited to Gottlob Frege rather than to Husserl. It is appropriate at this point to examine the relations between these two logicians. In fact, they corresponded with one another on various issues in mathematics and semantics in 1891, and again in 1906. Husserl was one of the first philosophers in Germany to recognize Frege's work, and, although he had criticized Frege's account of the nature of identity in the philosophy of arithmetic in 1891, relations between the two were collegial and mutually respectful. But, in 1894, Frege published an acerbic review of Husserl's philosophy of arithmetic, in which he accused Husserl of making a number of fundamental errors. 56 According to Frege, Husserl treated numbers naively as properties of things or of aggregates rather than as the extensions of concepts. The extension of a concept is the set of objects the concept picks out. 57 Husserl had seen number as deriving from our intuition of groups or multiplicities, and since neither 1 nor 0 is a multiple, strictly speaking they were not positive numbers for Husserl. Frege criticized Husserl's account of 0 and 1 as negative answers to the question, how many? Frege states that the answer to the question, how many moons has the Earth, is hardly a negative answer, as Husserl would have us believe. Furthermore, Frege believed, Husserl seemed to be confusing the numbers themselves with the presentations of number in consciousness, analogous to considering the moon as generated by our act of thinking about it. Crucially for Frege, in identifying the objective numbers with subjective acts of counting, Husserl was guilty of psychologism, the error of tracing the laws of logic to empirical psychological laws. If logic is defined as the study of the laws of thought, there is always the danger that this can be interpreted to mean the study of how people actually think or ought to think, understanding necessary entailment, for example, as that everyone is so constituted psychologically if he believes P, and if he believes that P implies Q then he cannot help believing that Q is true. For Frege, Husserl has collapsed the logical nature of judgment into private psychological acts, collapsing together truth and judging something as true. According to the journal kept by W. R. Boyce Gibson, who studied with Husserl in Freiburg in 1928, Husserl later acknowledged that Frege's criticisms had hit the nail on the head. On the other hand, there is considerable evidence that Husserl was already moving away from his own earlier psychologism when Frege's review was published, especially in his critique of Schroeder's algebra of logic. 58 Husserl was already embracing Bolzano's Wissenschaftslehre 59 with its doctrine of states of affairs and truths in themselves, whose precise nature he then came to understand through his reading of Hermann Lotz's account of the Platonic ideas, as he had reported in his reply to Melchior Paladii in 1903. Given the supposedly crucial importance of Frege's review of Husserl, it is surprising that Frege receives only one mention in the Prolegomena in a footnote, Pro. 45, Findlay I, 318, who 18, 172 n***, where Husserl writes, I need hardly say that I no longer approve of my own fundamental criticisms of Frege's anti-psychologistic position set forth in my philosophy of arithmetic. Husserl now cites both Frege's Die Grundlagen der Arithmetik, Foundations of Arithmetic, 1884, and the preface to his Grundgesetz der Arithmetik, Fundamental Laws of Arithmetic, 1893, as anti-psychologistic statements of which Husserl can now approve. In fact, Husserl had abandoned the approach of the philosophy of arithmetic almost as soon as it was published in 1891. He realized that the cardinal numbers were not the basis of all numbers, and in particular that the psychological approach could not handle the more complex numbers, for example, the imaginary numbers. In the prolegomena, Husserl explicitly denies that numbers themselves are to be understood in terms of acts of counting, although they can only be accessed through acts of counting. The number 5 is not my own or anyone else's counting of 5. It is also not my presentation or anyone else's presentation of 5. Lee, pro / 46, Findlay I, 109, Who 18, 173-4. While it is only by counting that we encounter numbers, numbers are not simply products of the mind. This would deny objective status to mathematics. The psychological origin of arithmetic concepts does not militate against the independent ideal existence of these concepts as species quite distinct from the contingency, temporality and transience of our mental acts. Lee, pro. 46, Findlay I, 110, Who 18, 175. 2 apples can be eaten but not the number 2, Husserl says in his 1906/7 lectures. For Husserl, logical concepts contain nothing of the process by which they are arrived at, any more than number has a connection with the psychological act of counting. Numbers and propositions, such as the Pythagorean theorem, are ideal objectivities. Gijanski and Lichketan, Findlay, objective correlates, which are the substrates of judgments just as much as any real object is. In contrast to real entities that bear some relation to time, if not to space, the pure identities of logic are irreal or ideal. Husserl characterized them as species in the Aristotelian sense, alongside other unities of meaning, for example the meaning of the word lion, a word which appears only once in the language despite its multiple instantiations in acts of speaking and writing. What is logically valid is a priori applicable to all worlds. In the prolegomena, then, Husserl holds a view similar to Wittgenstein in the Tractatus. Logic says nothing about the real world, the world of facts. It is a purely formal a priori science. Husserl, however, integrates logic into a broader conception of the theory of science. Whereas Husserl had begun in 1887 with the assumption that psychology would ground all cognitive acts, he ends the foreword to his investigations by quoting Goethe to the effect that one is against nothing so much as there is one has recently abandoned, in order to explain his frank critique, Die freie mutige Kritik, of psychologism. Lee, Findlay I, 3, Who 18, 7. While in agreement with Freud concerning the dangers of psychologism for logic, Husserl was not persuaded by Freud's project for mathematical logic as, in general, he was, as we have seen, suspicious of the purely formal turn to symbolic logic, exemplified in his day by the logical programs of George Boole, see Civ. 162, William Stanley Jevons and Ernst Schroeder, which for him contained theoretical flaws and confusions. That is not to say that Husserl thought of formalization as unnecessary. In fact, he saw it as the only purely scientific way of advancing logic. Lee, pro. 71, Findlay I, 158-9, Who 18, 254. Thus he praised the elegance with which mathematicians were expanding and transforming the domain of traditional logic, and he criticized those who refused to recognize the proper role of mathematics in these matters. However, Husserl believed that this mathematical tendency was manifesting itself as a kind of technical ability that had not reflected on the nature of its founding concepts. Philosophy must try to think through the essential meanings of logical procedures. The philosopher is not content with the fact that we find our way about in the world, that we have legal formulae which enable us to predict the future course of things, or to reconstruct its past course. He wants to clarify the essence of a thing, an event, a cause, an effect, of space, of time, etc., as well as that wonderful affinity which this essence has with the essence of thought, which enables it to be thought, with the essence of knowledge, which makes it knowable, with meaning which make it capable of being meant, etc. Pro. 71, Findlay I, 159, Who 18, 255. As Husserl put it in his 1906/7 lectures, Introduction to Logic and Theory of Knowledge, one must distinguish between mathematical logic and philosophical logic. Who Civ. 163. Towards the end of his life, Husserl would repeat this criticism in The Crisis of European Sciences, where he would criticize this idealization of a logic which does not understand itself and claim that a formal deductive system is not in itself an explanatory system. Crisis, 55, Car. 189, Who 6, 193. For Husserl, purely extensionalist logic or calculus could never be more than a brilliant technique. From the prolegomena onwards, Husserl offered a complex account of the full nature of what he called formal logic, utilizing a much wider conception than is now current. In some respects his account of logic is quite traditional, being centered on the notion of judgment or assertion, Greek, apophancy, and hence is, following Aristotle, characterized as apophantic logic. Seeley, 414, Findlay 2, 72, Who 19/I, 344. On the other hand, in formal and transcendental logic, 12-15, Husserl articulated this mature vision of this formal logic, which for him included formal grammar or what he called the pure theory of forms of meaning that laid down the conditions of meaning combination as such, then a second level of consequence logic or the logic of validity which is concerned with inference, and finally a logic of truth, which recognized that logic aims not only at formal validity but seeks to articulate truth. In the prolegomena, Husserl also saw the need for a general theory of manifolds or the theory of the possible forms of theories to complete his account of the nature of logic in general. We cannot deal with the complexities of Husserl's vision of logic here, except to note that in the investigations Husserl was not pursuing an objectivist account of logic as his exclusive aim. Husserl recognized the essential two-sidedness of the acts which are aimed at logical meanings. On the one hand there are the laws governing the meanings themselves, but there are also the judgings, inferrings, and other acts, which are oriented towards the subjective side, that need to be treated by phenomenology, formal and transcendental logic 8. In other words, the aim of phenomenology is to study the essential correlations between acts of knowing and the objects known, something that became clearer to Husserl after he wrote the investigations. The structure of the 6 investigations while the prolegomena was written with a single purpose and, by Husserl's standards, remains a relatively straightforward piece of writing. The 6 investigations of the second volume at first sight seem much less unified and coherent, with most commentators testifying to their uneven, fragmentary and sprawling character. Husserl himself warned that the work could not be considered as a finished exposition of scientific results or as one book or work in the literary sense, Lee, Findlay I, 5, Who 18, 11, but rather should be seen as a systematically bound chain of investigations, a series of analytical investigations, Ein Rehan Literature unter Sachungen, Lee, Findlay I, 173, Who 19/I, 20, which would need further elaboration through resolute cooperation among a generation of research workers, Lee, Findlay I, 171, Who 19/I, 16-17. It had to be seen as a living development of philosophical ideas, a journal of philosophical discovery. A recent commentator, Kit Fine, has remarked, referring specifically to the third investigation but applicable with justice to the whole, such is the range of the work that it is with a growing sense of excitement that one discovers the riches that lie beneath its rough and seemingly impenetrable exterior. 60 David Bell has identified a threefold structure to the work, with the prolegomena establishing the need for ideal unities in logic and knowledge generally, the first 4 investigations clarifying issues of linguistics, semantics, formal ontology and formal grammar, while the final 2 investigations were properly phenomenological, studying the nature of conscious acts and their claim to knowledge and truth. 61 The investigations, then, is more united than its outward appearance suggests, and rich in sophisticated philosophical insights, albeit embedded in Husserl's wordy and labyrinthine presentation. In part, the progressive structure of the work is obscured by Husserl's tendency to enter into exhaustive critiques of other positions in order to arrive at his own view in circuitous manner, and then set out again circumspectly and tentatively, warning always of the need for further analyses and distinctions to be borne in mind. 62 One always has the sense of philosophizing in progress rather than of a completed system, of listening to a great mind communing with itself. According to the author, the investigations proceed by lifting the reader from lower to higher levels, moving in a zigzag manner, im zigzag, Lee, Findlay I, 175, who are 19/1, 22, forced to employ concepts that would be clarified later in a reflective turning back, Zurückkehren. Indeed, Husserl's whole approach has the character of such backward questioning, Rückfragen. The 6 lengthy investigations of the second volume are concerned with analyzing elements of the form of knowledge, such notions as meaning, concept, proposition, truth, Lee // 71, Findlay I, 159-60, who 18, 236-7. Husserl begins with the general structure of signs and meaningful expressions, then moves to analyze the status of universals, which he calls species, and the nature of abstraction, followed by a treatise on the laws governing the relations of dependence between parts and wholes, another mini-treatise on the relation between logic and grammar as a priori disciplines, the nature of consciousness, including the meaning of intentionality and the ambiguities surrounding the associated notions of content, object, presentation, and finally the nature of the identifying syntheses involved in judgment and its relation to truth. Along the way, he offers sharp criticisms of prevailing views, including a critique of J.S. Mill's account of connotation and denotation, a refutation of sensationalism, a rebuttal of empiricist theories of abstraction, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Mill, a sharpened definition of the a priori including a new distinction between the formal, analytic, and material, synthetic, a priori which claims to be an advance on Kant, and careful discussions of Bolzano, Mill, Brentano and others, in terms of their views on logic, psychology and the nature of judgments and their contents. A basic assumption of Husserl's understanding of knowledge is that knowledge is essentially understood and communicated in the form of expressive statements, where a statement is a unified whole with a single, possibly complex, meaning, that says something about something. It refers to an object, whether an individual thing or a state of affairs, through a sense or meaning. Husserl employs both Sinn and Bedeutung for meaning. Of course, in the logical investigations, and indeed since 1891, Husserl was fully aware of Freud's distinction between Sinn, sense, and Bedeutung, reference or meaning, but he does not observe it since it is at variance with ordinary German usage. Husserl prefers to use the terms Sinn, Bedeutung and also Meinung more or less as equivalent notions, see Lee 22, Findlay I, 240, who are 19/1, 115, although later, in Ideas I 124, he will restrict Bedeutung to linguistic meaning only and use Sinn more broadly to include all meanings, including non-conceptual contents, for example, perceptual sense. Both Freud and Husserl agree that the sense of a statement is an ideal unity not affected by the psychic act grasping it, nor by the psychic stuff, mental imagery, feelings, and so on, that accompanies the psychological episode. Logic, and mathematics and the other formal sciences, is concerned to process the laws governing these abstract ideal unities which Husserl characterizes as having being in itself, unsixein, translated by Findlay as intrinsic being, as unities in manifolds, Findlay I, 169, who are 19/I, 12, as well as a being for, physixein, the thinker. In themselves, they are pure identities, remaining unchanged irrespective of their being counted, judged, or otherwise apprehended in psychic acts. As Husserl says in the Prolegomena, truths are what they are irrespective of whether humans grasp them at all. Professor 65, Findlay I, 150, who 18, 240. Despite the fact that the objects of logic are ideal and transtemporal, nevertheless, they must also be accessible and graspable by the human mind. As Husserl later explains, it is unthinkable that such ideal objects could not be apprehended in appropriate subjective psychic acts and experiences. 63 We can imagine any such ideal meaning or Sinn being entertained or judged or considered in some way by mind. It is simply a fact that these ideal meanings, Sinn, present themselves to us as something that is subjectively grasped. Ideal objects confront us as subjectively produced formations in the lived experiencing and doing of the forming. 64 This is their being for. They are always truths for some possible mind. Subjective acts are constituting acts for these ideal objectivities. The question then becomes, how are these hidden psychic experiences correlated to the idealities? Freud had answered in a naive manner, our minds simply grasp ideal thoughts. But Husserl wants to give an account that does justice to the essential two-sidedness of our cognitive achievements by analyzing the structure of this expressing and grasping of meaning. For Husserl, the primary interest of what he calls phenomenology in the second volume of the investigations does not lie in identifying the ideal nature of the idealities, numbers, logical entities, pure meanings, that are the focus of mathematics, logic, semantics and other sciences. Rather, Husserl is primarily interested in the mental acts correlated with these ideal objectivities and the laws governing these essential intentional correlations. See Huxley, 172. Initially, he tended to understand these acts as psychological realities which instantiate pure essences in a kind of token/type relation. To get at their essential natures he initially thought he could use Brentanian descriptive psychology. After 1901 Husserl realized he was mistaken to characterize in psychological terms what were the essences of cognitive acts and their correlative objects. Psychic acts, like physical objects, are parts of the natural world and are governed by temporal relations and other features of our contingent universe. The essential structures of acts of cognition, on the other hand, were not parts of the world, and hence could not be treated by psychology. Thus it was some 4 years after the investigations, as Husserl recalled in the Crisis 70, Ca. 243, Who 6, 246, that he arrived at self-consciousness regarding the true nature of the phenomenological method uncovered in 1901. He then realized that pure transcendental phenomenology has essentially to replace descriptive psychology and that real/ideal distinction had to be replaced by a purely essential study of the noetic/noematic structure of intentional experiences. Husserl thinks the intentional acts themselves can be isolated as true for all possible consciousnesses. Phenomenology does not discuss states of animals, but rather perceptions as such, willings as such, just as pure arithmetic deals with pure number and geometry deals with pure shapes, and not actual shapes as encountered in nature. For Husserl, it was the task of phenomenology to delineate in advance the possible forms of each intentional act and its limits. This is why phenomenology despite its descriptive rigor is actually an a priori science, not an empirical one. Husserl is aware that one cannot just assume one has a grasp of the concepts just because one understands the meanings of the words that express the concepts. There are concealed ambiguities in the linguistic expressions, and so it is necessary to fix our concepts through clear self-sustaining intuitions. We desire to render self-evident in full-fledged intuitions that what is here given in actually performed abstractions is what the word meanings in our expression of the law really and truly stand for. Lee, Findlay I, 168, who are 19/1, 10. The aim is to achieve clarity and distinctness in concepts by making whatever appropriate disambiguations as can be brought to intuitive clarity. For Husserl, questions concerning the relation of the objective to the subjective acts of the mind, questions of the meaning of the so-called adequatia rei ad intellectus, cannot be separated from issues in pure logic. Such questions as how these ideal objectivities come to be presented to the mind and grasped by it and so end up becoming something subjective must be addressed. How can the ideality of the universal qua concept or law enter the flux of real mental states and become an epistemic possession of the thinking person? Lee, Intro. 2. Findlay I. 169, who are 19 13. How is there an adequatia rei int lectus in the case of the relation between ideal concepts and human psychical acts? We have to pass over from a naive performance of acts to an attitude of reflection, Instellung der Reflection. Husserl wants to discover the a priori relations between meaning and its expression, and he sets out the basis of this in the first investigation. The first investigation, the nature of meaningful expression. Although, at first glance, the first investigation appears to be an essay on signs, Zekin, clearly influenced by Mill's logic, Lee I 16, and by linguistic studies by Brentanists such as Twardowski and Anton Marty. In fact, Husserl intended it to have a merely preparatory character, Lee, Findlay I, 6-7, who 18, 13, aiming correctly to identify the elements of the meaning function, Bedeutungsfunction, function, in conscious life. Although it contains discussions of proper names, common names, collective terms, demonstratives, speech acts, and so on, Husserl's interest was not in philosophy of language as such, but rather in specifying the structure of meaningful assertion, separating out the acts which go to make up the intentional expression and fulfillment of meaning. In this first investigation, 9, Husserl develops his crucial distinction, held from early in his career, between meaning intending and meaning fulfilling acts and the unity of coincidence or covering, der Kunsteinheit, between meant and fulfilled senses in those situations where a concrete intuition fills out the intending sense. As Husserl's conception of signification became more nuanced, this investigation was considerably reworked in the second edition. Husserl begins from Mill's claim that, since all thought is expressed in language, a study of linguistic forms is a prerequisite to the clarification of logical forms. He departs from Mill, however, in his account of the manner in which proper names, schools, Socrates, signify their reference. Drawing on and refining some traditional distinctions in then current semantics, for example, Marty, Husserl distinguishes between the function of an expression to intimate, die Kunstgebendy function, something to someone, and its expression of an ideal sense or meaning, Sinn or Bedeutung, which is the same in different performances of the assertion or in acts of understanding it. Moreover, normally an act of expressing is directed beyond its meaning to its associated object or objectivity, Zugerreichgegenständlichkeit, through a specific manner of intentional reference, intentional Beziehung. Finally, Husserl has a brief introductory discussion of the different kinds of objectivities to which things can be directed, distinguishing between simple and categorial objectivities, Lee I 12, the focus of the sixth investigation. Husserl begins by distinguishing between signs functioning as indications, and Zekin, which operate through linking one extant thing with another without a mediating meaning, for example, smoke indicating fire, flag is a sign of a nation, a brand that marks a slave, chalk that marks out a house, and expressions, die Ausdruck, in his specific sense, that require the mediation of a meaning or sense and refer to some object regardless of its existential status. As Husserl says, it is part of the notion of an expression to have a meaning, Lee I 15. A meaningless expression, for example, abracadabra, would not be an expression at all. This is not meant to be an exhaustive treatment of signs and signification, but merely a distinction between different functions of signs. Husserl is interested in the mental act of meaningful expression, irrespective of whether it is uttered, written, or simply thought to oneself. His account is a semantics of speaker intention. Communication is not Husserl's concern, because, for him, logic is concerned only with the expression of ideal meanings. The pragmatics of communication or reception of meaning is a secondary matter, a concern for the philosopher of language. An expression may have a set of physical sounds or written marks or merely imagined utterance, but what makes it an expression, and not just a reproduction of sounds like a parrot, is the mental state, or act, that enlivens or ensouls it. Normally, in any expressive act, the inner fused unity, Einigliche Verschmolzeneinheit, Lee I 10, of sign and thing signified, of word and object, is experienced. Our interest usually focuses on the object intended and not on either the meaning or any associated verbal chain, unless our interest is, let us say, in assonance or in grammar. For example, if someone says, I done that, the speaker's attention may be directed at confirming having done something and not towards the poor grammatical form. This is not to say that the thought exists apart from its expression. Thoughts come to form in a linguistic way. There are many other features entwined with the act of expression. Husserl further distinguishes between what expression shows forth, conveys, or intimates, conjugt, and what it means, and between what it means and what object it names, Lee I 6. Typically, Husserl recognizes the inherent complexities, even if he here does not focus on them. For instance, in communication, an expression both expresses a meaning and indicates something to the hearer. An expression functions as an indication when, for example, it indicates to the hearer the meaning intentions of the speaker, Lee I 7. Through this intimating function other aspects of the communicative situation may be picked up, for example, that the speaker is angry or is making a judgment. Expressions, then, have a communicative function in relation to others. A speaker endows a certain word chain with a sense that can be understood by a hearer, with certain sense-giving acts, Symbolized die Act, Lee I 7. This, Husserl says, makes mental commerce, geistige Verkehr, possible. But besides their function in communication with others, expressions play a role in our individual, solitary, mental life, where communicating has no role, and therefore the act of meaning, Akt des Bedeutens, must be strictly distinguished from its intimation achievement, die Kunstgebendy Leistung, Lee I 8. When an expression is articulated it normally directs interest away from itself towards what it intends to convey, but this directing away is not a form of indicating. 8. In silent soliloquy we may use imagined words rather than spoken words, we may even imagine the sounds of the words. Here we express our meanings although we do not intimate them to others. The expression of meaning, therefore, remains an issue even for the solitary thinker, Lee I 8, where no indicative function is required. Husserl distinguishes between expressions which function solely to name, nennen, and other more complicated forms, which Husserl calls predicatively formed complexes which are essentially predicates. Husserl thinks that the referential power of proper names has been misunderstood by Mill, who views a proper name as non-connotative and directly denoting its subject, in Mill's terminology, without the mediation of an abstract meaning, or attribute. 65 names do pick out their objects directly, but not through indication, rather they have an expressive function that allows the name to mean the object in different sentential formations. According to Husserl's fundamental distinction between meaning intentions and meaning fulfillments, meaning intentions, Bedeutungsintentionen, or meaning conferring acts, die Bedeutungsverleihenden Akt, include all those acts involved in confirming, corroborating, illustrating, erfüllen, bestätigen, bekräftigen, illustrieren, Lee I 9. An expression has to be consciously endowed with meaning to be a vehicle of meaning. The content or meaning of the thought expressed is furthermore an ideal unity, for example, 3 perpendiculars of a triangle intersect in a point, Lee I 11. This meaning is something identical, das Identische, whose precise identity is preserved in repetition, Wiederholung, of the expression. In assertion, we are asserting that state of affairs holds or obtains. We commit ourselves to the objective validity of the state of affairs, even though the state of affairs is what it is, whether we maintain its validity or not. It is a validity unity in itself, Eingeltungseinheit sich. We judge that the state of affairs obtains because we see it to be so. Every expression says something of or about, über, something, Lee 11, but the object does not usually coincide with the meaning. Different names, for example, Victor of Jena, vanquished at Waterloo, or London, Londres, can refer to the same object, Napoleon, the city of London. Expressions may have different meanings but the same objective reference. Similarly, expressions with the same meaning may have different objective references. For example, the expression horse is applied to different horses, to both the individual Bucephalus and to the type, the car horse, 12. Proper names are equivocal for Husserl in that they can name something different only if they mean something different. They have multiple senses, 15. On the other hand, general names, words like horse can have many different values but have the one meaning, 15. In general, Husserl wants to distinguish between the meaning, Bedeutung, of an expression and its power to name, that is, to direct itself to something objective, Eingegenstehend. An expression names its object through, mit/s, its meaning, Lee 13. In the first investigation, Husserl distinguishes between objective expressions and those subjective expressions whose meaning shifts with the occasion. This broad category, which includes pronouns, I, you, demonstratives, this, that, temporal adverbs like now, he terms essentially occasional expressions, wesentlich occasion /la or struck, Lee 26. These depend on the context for their specific meaning and yet also seem to have a fixed sense of their own. Now means the present time, I means the person who is currently speaking. But Husserl recognizes that one cannot simply replace the word I with the person who is currently speaking in all contexts and preserve meaning, Lee 26. The term, however, is not wholly equivocal, but has layered elements, one of which depends on the context in which it is used, the indicated meaning, and the other meaning which shows an act of indicating or pointing is being performed, the indicative meaning, Lee 26, Findlay I, 219, who are 19/1, 89. 66 in the first edition, indexicals are treated as non-normal or derivative forms of meaning, unlike words like lion, which could, at least in theory, be replaced by non-indexical expressions, Lee 28, although Husserl recognizes this may be practically impossible. Husserl saw the need to broaden this account in the sixth investigation, Lee 6/5, so that indexicals stand at the basis of all empirical predication, a change of mind Husserl notes in the second edition, Lee, Findlay I, 7, who 18, 13. In a sense, every statement must be located in a context before its precise meaning can be understood. For example, referring to the birth of Christ, or the Son requires a certain deixis, see Husserl's notes, who are 19/2, 817. In 1929, Informal and Transcendental Logic, 80, who are 17, 207, Husserl says that in the first edition of the investigations he had not understood the horizontal intentionality at work whereby the understanding of a statement requires attention to its horizon in context. A formal system needs the support of context-relative elements. Husserl also discusses another kind of expression where the mental act the speaker is performing is announced in the expression itself, for example, in speech acts where the speaker promises, wishes, and so on. Husserl here identifies the class of speech acts, subsequently studied by his student, Adolf Reinach. Interest in speech acts was revived by John Austin and systematized by John Searle. 67 An important part of the discussion in the first investigation concerns Husserl's vigorous attempts to distinguish between the meaning of an expression and the various accompanying images, feelings and illustrations that intertwine with it. Husserl's aim is to distinguish the logical content of meaning from all accompanying psychological content. He remarks that even Descartes had distinguished the imaginative representation of a chiligan from its conceptual meaning, Lee 18. A central issue of this investigation is the distinction between expressions based on intuition and those which function through some kind of symbolization. Seeing something in the case of perceiving an object and seeing it symbolically are different act functions for Husserl, Lee 20. Husserl was not satisfied with his account of expression in this investigation and his advances in the sixth investigation forced him to rethink the very basis of his account in the years after 1901. His 1908 lectures on meaning, for example, offer the basis for a revised account, which has a more sophisticated treatment of the relation between expressive act, meaning and empty or filled intention. In later years, Husserl would constantly return to the essential nature of meaning intending in its various forms. The second investigation, abstraction and the grasp of universals. The second investigation treats of the nature of universal meanings or species, as Husserl calls them. Understanding the true nature of abstraction is important for the foundations of logic, since logic utilizes the crucial distinction between individual and general or universal objects, Allgemeingegenstehende. Husserl wants to develop empiricism by defending the need to recognize universal objects also, a view which is best understood as a kind of Aristotelianism. Some critics, however, accused Husserl of Platonism. In a remark added in the second edition, he concedes that his view may be termed idealism, Lee 2, Findlay I, 238, who are 19/1, 112, understood as a purely epistemological doctrine, which recognizes the proper domain of the ideal, das Idee, against psychologism. Husserl in fact thinks that the excesses of extreme conceptual realism, Begriffsrealismus, Lee 2, have led philosophers to challenge not just the reality of general concepts but also their objectivity. In this investigation Husserl offers primarily a historical critique of Locke, Berkeley, Hume and of abstractionist representationalism in general, with the overall aim of understanding the relation between meaning as an ideal unity and the act of meaning, das Bedeutung, expressing it. In the prolegomena Husserl had already established that meanings are ideal unities. Now he wants to specify the relation between this ideal unity of meaning and the expression which means it, the significant or meaning consciousness, Bedeutungsbewusstsein. Husserl's claim, developed from Lotz, in the first edition is that this relation is the same as that between species and individuals. Indeed, for Husserl, meaning is a kind of species, which is instantiated in a particular act. The traditional account says that we intend the species, for example, horse as opposed to an individual horse, by abstraction from the individual, but there are different accounts of the nature of this abstraction. One view he rejects is that abstraction is a kind of selective attention on one aspect of an object. In opposition to this view, Husserl wants to develop a proper concept of abstraction, freed from the distortions of the modern philosophical and psychological tradition. He calls this ideation but revises his views in the second edition since, in Ideas I, Husserl had developed a new account of ideation now understood as essential seeing or essence inspection, was sense showing, Ideas I 3. For Husserl, the difference between an act that intends an individual and one that intends the species becomes clear in reflecting on the manner in which evidence is fulfilled for such presentations, Lee 2:1. Husserl insists that intending the species is essentially different in kind from intending the individual qua individual. In both acts, the same concrete object, das Concretum, may be given, with the same sense contents interpreted in exactly the same way, Lee 2:1, but we mean red not red house, the species not the individual. In the act of individual reference, we intend this thing or property or part of the thing, whereas in the specific act we intend the species, that is, we intend not the thing or a property understood in the here and now, but rather the content, hold, the idea, die/d, that is read as opposed to the individual read moment, Lee 2:1. As Husserl adds in the second edition, referring forward to the sixth investigation, this specific act is a founded, fundiert, act, involving a new mode of apprehension, or wise, which sets the species before us as a general object. When we mean the species we perform a distinct act which is oriented towards the species as such and not towards the individual thing or part. Husserl understands this relation between general and individual as that between species and individual instance, Einzelfall 1, between read in general and this read moment of an object. Husserl goes on to insist, too, on an important difference between individual singular items, Einzelheiten, things of experience, and specific singulars, for example, the number 2. He makes a parallel distinction between individual and specific universals, whereby individual universal judgments, for example, all men are mortal, are distinguished from specific universal judgments, for example, all propositions of logic are a priori. Husserl offers deep criticisms of the prevailing empiricist and nominalist accounts of the process by which universals are distinguished in our knowledge. Husserl ends by introducing his notions of abstract, dependent parts and concrete, independent parts, as a way of beginning to understand the true nature of abstraction in a phenomenological manner. This leads him to the theory of parts and wholes. The third logical investigation, parts and wholes. Husserl himself stressed the importance of the third investigation as offering the proper way into his thought, and, in his 1913 revision, was already lamenting its neglect. This investigation sketches a pure theory of wholes and parts, called, in the second edition, formal ontology, Lee 3, Findlay 2, 3, who are 19/1, 228, inaugurating a discipline now known as mereology. With the specific view of clarifying the relations holding between the parts of meaningful acts of expression, in the fifth and sixth investigations, Husserl here attempts to specify the a priori possibilities inherent in part-whole relations in general, i.e., the precise forms part-whole relations can take in advance of all empirical instances, Lee 3:1. Husserl is interested in the different ways in which something can be a part, and the laws governing the relation of parts to the whole, and of parts to other parts. Every object either is or can be a part. Wholes can be parts of larger wholes, and parts can have parts. Not all parts can be wholes, however. Wholes and parts stand in various relations of dependency, unselbstständigkeit, such that one part is founded on another. Husserl gives a strict sense to foundation, a notion already present in Mengen when part A cannot be presented without a part B, is said to be founded on B, Lee 3:14. Husserl's account recapitulates his studies of the early 1890s. His starting point, Lee 3:3, is his mentor Karl Stumpf's work on the relations between parts and wholes in psychological acts, specifically in relation to sensory concepts such as color and extension, or the quality and intensity of sounds. Stumpf situated his discussion of part/whole relations specifically in relation to psychology, whereas Husserl wants to formalize to a pure theory of wholes and parts in the most general sense. Stumpf was influenced by Brentano's reflections on the subject in his lectures on descriptive psychology 68, and Husserl also acknowledges the independent investigations of Christian von Ehrenfels on form qualities, Gestaltqualitäten, Lee 3:4, where items are grouped in specific ways, for example, flocks, points seen against a background, and so on. 69 Husserl even discovers whole/part analysis in the phenomenology of inner experience of George Berkeley in his critique of Locke, Lee 3:2. Husserl begins somewhat misleadingly by discussing the different ways parts are presented and are differentiated in experience, but in fact wants a formal analysis of the manner in which parts and wholes of any objects whatsoever cohere or coexist together. Anything that can be distinguished in an object is a part, tier. Parts may be divided into independent, selbstständig, and dependent, unselbstständig, according as they can stand on their own or whether they require inherence in the whole of which they are a part. A part may be independently presented, for example, head of a horse, and these Husserl terms pieces, stuck, Lee 3:2, for example, the segments of an orange which can stand apart from one another and from the whole. But some parts are inseparable, untrennbar, for example, color and extension, and these Husserl calls moments and which he sometimes characterizes as abstract parts in that they can only appear in the context of a larger whole. A dependent moment is one that depends, or, in Husserl's language, is founded on another whole or part. Thus, to give an example, Husserl will constantly repeat, the act quality of a conscious experience is an abstract moment of the act, Lee 3:20, unthinkable detached from all matter. Of course, one can isolate parts within parts, so that the whole notions of dependence and independence are relativized, Lee 3:13. Husserl goes on to lay down 6 laws concerning parts and wholes, Lee 3:14, which have since been modified and expanded in a whole formal mereological theory. These laws include, for example, the law that, if or is dependent part of a whole W, then it is also a dependent part of any other whole that has W as a part. In later writings, for example, Experience and Judgment and Formal and Transcendental Logic, Husserl returns to part-whole relations in a somewhat different analysis, but his part-whole analysis always remains central to his philosophy. The fourth investigation, Formal Grammar. The fourth investigation, extensively revised and expanded in the second edition, is a study of what Husserl terms pure grammar, second edition, pure logical grammar, i.e., of the formal laws governing the combining or binding of meanings, Bedeutungen, into a senseful unity rather than simply yielding a nonsensical string of words, and is, generally speaking, an application of his part-whole theory to the field of semantics. He speaks of the pure theory of forms of meanings, Die reine Formenlehre der Bedeutungen, Lee 4:14. The aim is to provide a pure morphology of meaning that lays the basis by providing possible forms of logical judgments, whose objective validity is the focus of formal logic proper. Husserl is explicitly reviving the old idea of an a priori grammar against both the psychological interpretations of grammar dominant in his day and the empirical theorists who were imprisoned in a false paradigm, for example, assuming Latin grammar as a paradigm, Lee 4:14. Just as simple objects can be combined to produce complex objects, simple meanings combine to produce complex meanings, Lee 4:2. Moreover, meaning parts need not mirror parts of the object, and vice versa. Meaning has its own parts and wholes. Husserl maintains that all combinations are governed by laws. His aim is to find the least number of independent elementary laws, Lee 4:13. It must be possible to identify the rules of all such possible valid combinations a priori, combinations that produce well-formed expressions as opposed to nonsense, such as this careless is green, Lee 4:10. Husserl famously distinguished, Lee I:15 and Lee 4:12, between nonsense, unsin, and countersense or absurdity, widersin. The concept of square circle is not senseless or nonsensical, but constitutes an absurdity, a contradiction in terms, a countersense that cannot be realized. Formal grammar, on Husserl's account, can eliminate only nonsense not absurdity and is therefore not yet formal logic in the sense of specifying what can be objectively valid. 70 in later writings, notably the formal and transcendental logic and experience and judgment, Husserl continued to maintain that formal grammar provided the bedrock rules for meaningfulness which made possible formal logic, and is the basis for both the logic of inference, consequence logic, and what Husserl calls the logic of truth. He is more careful in later writings to emphasize that he is dealing with formal combinations of meanings, for example, and be not if, rather than material combinations of meanings, for example, round square, whereas in the fourth investigation he tends misleadingly to employ examples drawn from the material sphere. 71. The laws of formal meaning are purely analytic laws as opposed to synthetic a priori laws which govern such areas as geometry or mechanics. The core of Husserl's analysis is his use of a traditional distinction, but specifically developed by Anton Marti, between syncatagormatic words, for example, words like but, and, to, if, and catagormatic words, for example, nouns, verbs, but not complete expressions, and his analysis of these in terms of independence and dependence relations. Husserl treats syncatagormatic expressions as meaningful but dependent, incomplete parts of wholes, which in this case are well-formed expressions which are complete or closed, geschlossen. Verbal parts can be distinguished in terms of those that are separately meaningful, like particles, for example, bi as in bisexual, or meaningless, bi as in bite. Husserl focuses on proper names and the manner in which they name the object in a single ray. The formal theory of meanings will lay down the formal laws that regulate how adjectives can become substantives, how a subject can shift to the predicate position and so on, and other rules of combination and modification, a concept drawn from Twardowski, who studied the manner certain adjectives modify the noun. For example, a false friend is not a friend at all. This investigation had a profound influence on the work of the linguist Roman Jakobson, 1896–1982, especially on his notion of phonemes as complex unities. 72. It also influenced the Polish logician Stanislaw Lesniewski, 1886–1939, in his account of categorical grammar, and indeed finds echoes in Noam Chomsky's project of a universal grammar, a term Husserl himself invokes with approval, Lee 414. For Husserl, however, the meaningfulness of linguistic combinations is distinct from the structural laws governing conscious acts and their contents, to which he turns in the fifth investigation. The fifth investigation, Intentional Experiences and Their Contents. The fifth logical investigation, subtitled International Experiences and Their Contents, is Husserl's attempt to sort out ambiguities in Brentano's descriptive psychological analysis of conscious acts, their contents and objects. In the second edition, these are restricted to pure immanence. Husserl begins by specifying what he means by consciousness, bracketing discussion of the relation of conscious acts to an ego, and focusing exclusively on the intentional character of conscious experiences deriving from Brentano's rediscovery of intentionality. However, Husserl regards Brentano's characterization of intentionality as misleading and inadequate, trapped inside the old Cartesian dualism of subject and object and with all the problems inherent in that representationalist account. Under the notion of objectifying act, he offers a more precise account of what Brentano called presentation, and goes on to address what he calls cardinal problem of phenomenology, namely, the doctrine of judgment, Lee, Findlay I, 7, who 1814, which is further treated in the sixth investigation. Husserl is especially critical of the many unresolved ambiguities in Brentano's foundational concept of presentation, Vorstellung, and carefully differentiates between the many senses of the term, Lee v 44, stressing however that logic must decide which meaning of presentation is most appropriate for its own needs. Logic does not follow linguistic usage as logical definition is a kind of artifice, Lee 4.3. In Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint, 1874, Brentano had held that all psychic acts are characterized by directedness or aboutness. Every mental phenomenon is characterized by what the scholastics of the Middle Ages called the intentional, or mental, inexistence of an object, and what we might call, though not wholly unambiguously, reference to a content, direction towards an object, which is not to be understood here as meaning a thing, or immanent objectivity. 73. In a general sense, every psychic act intends an object, though not necessarily something existent. Husserl paraphrases, in perception something is perceived, in imagination, something imagined, in a statement something stated, in love something loved, in hate hated, in desire desired, etc. Lee v 10, Findlay 2, 95, who are 19/I, 380. Brentano himself came to realize that his expression intentional in existence, which he claimed he had used to express the concept of inherence or inness of the scholastics, had been misunderstood as a special kind of subsistence. In his later writings, he claimed he never intended to say that the intentional object is merely some kind of object in our minds, some purely immanent thing. Husserl rejects Brentano's attempt to distinguish between psychical and physical phenomena, but sees his discovery of intentionality as having independent value, Lee v 9. Husserl is cautious about using Brentano's term act without qualification, but, above all, wants to avoid misleading talk of immanent objectivity. He insists that all objects of thought, including the objects of fantasy and memory, are mind-transcendent. Even when I am imagining something non-existent, for example, if I am thinking of the mythical god Jupiter, the god Jupiter is not inside my thought in any sense, it is not a real element or real part of the experience, Lee v 11. Rather, even fictional objects are transcendent above our mental experiences. Intentional experience always transcends itself towards the object. Its character is a pointing beyond itself towards, Tyber sich hinausweisen, something. Drawing on the older logical tradition, Husserl offers a new global distinction between the matter and the quality of intentional acts. Acts of different quality, judgings, wishings, questionings, may have the same matter. Not all our experiences are intentional in the sense of presenting something to our attention. According to Husserl, sensations in themselves are not intentional, they are not the object which we intend, rather they accompany the intentional act and fill it out. Sensations belong to the matter, and are grasped as such only in reflection, whereas the act quality provides the form of the act. With an eye to distinctions made by Brentano's followers, especially Casimir Twardowski, Husserl goes on to develop the differences between the contents of experience and the properties of the mind-transcendent object. When I see an object, I only ever see it from one side, in a certain kind of light, from a certain angle and so on. As I walk around the box, for example, I see different profiles, abscottungen, or aspects of the box, and yet I know I am getting glimpses of the same object in the different perceptual acts. The same object is presenting itself to me in different modes. Husserl's distinction in the fifth investigation, Lee v 17, between the object which is intended and the particular mode under which it is intended forms the basis for his later distinction between noesis and noema in ideas I. Furthermore, Husserl regards it as an a priori law that physical objects are displayed in abscottungen. Whereas Brentano recognized only three basic classes of psychical acts, namely, presentations, judgments, and what he called phenomena of love and hate, Husserl recognizes myriad forms of intentional structure. He more carefully differentiates the fundamental structure of judgments in a manner opposed to Brentano, who had challenged the traditional notion of judgment as a synthesis of subject and predicate, and had interpreted the judgment the cat is black as an asserting or positing of black cat. Husserl denies that judgments can be treated as nominal acts, as simply naming complex states of affairs, Lee v 17. We can, of course, turn a judgment into a nominal act, by nominalizing the content of the judgment. This belongs as an a priori essential possibility to judgments, Lee v 36. So, to the judgment the cat is black corresponds the nominalization the cat's being black, which can then function as the basis for further judgments. But this internal relation between judging and nominalizing does not mean that they are essentially the same kind of act. Husserl, following Bolzano, declares judgments to be essentially different from presentations. Judgments assert something to be the case. Levy 33. A judgment articulates and specifies in a many-rayed act the parts of the situation that a nominalizing act presents in a single-rayed act. As Husserl puts it. 74 The relation between presentation and judgment is not as described by Brentano. Rather than operating with Brentano's simple and rather naive distinction between the presenting act and presented content of an intention, or even using the broader notion of a nominal act, Husserl suggests that we ought to speak more generally of objectivating acts. Levy 37, which include both the nominal and the judgmental act. Husserl thinks that the claim that all acts either are or are founded on objectifying acts is a more accurate reformulation of Brentano's basic law that all psychic acts are either presentations or founded on presentations. Husserl's clarification of the nature of presentation and judgment leads to his discussion of the manner in which these acts find intuitive fulfillment in the sixth investigation. The sixth logical investigation, towards the phenomenology of knowledge. The sixth investigation, by far the longest and most difficult, attempts to connect the previous analyses of the act of meaning to the notion of truth through a deeper exploration of the relations between the acts that intend meaning and the various levels of possible fulfillment, as they feature in different kinds of conscious act, for example, perceptions, imaginings, and acts of what Husserl calls signative intention where meanings are handled in a purely symbolic way without intuitive fullness. Husserl's target is knowledge and the connection with truth. In earlier investigations Husserl had recognized a new class of categorial acts or acts of categorial intuition, founded on sensuous acts but with essentially different objects. The sixth investigation is the first full analysis of the nature of these categorial acts, including reviewing the relation of sensory matter to the content of the act as a whole. Husserl wants a phenomenology of the varying degrees of knowledge. Lee 6, Findlay 2, 184, Who 19/2, 539, carefully discriminating between the many different senses in which something can be realized or fulfilled for us in an act of perception or imagination, the relation between concept and intuition, for example, in the act of seeing a blackbird. Husserl sees the paradigm case of a successful intentional act as an act where the meaning is fulfilled by the presence in intuition of the intended object with full bodily presence, Life of Dick Keat. Thus, when I actually see something before my eyes, I have a fulfilled intuition. Later, I can relive this intuition but it is now a memory, still oriented to the object, but not presented with the same presence or immediacy. In memory or in other forms of calling to mind or representing, Verges and Wittigang, we still may have a full intuition of the object, but now no longer with the distinctive bodily presence that characterizes perception. There are other forms of intending which are merely empty, Lehrmeinen, for example, when I use words in a casual way without really thinking about what I am saying, when I talk about something without really thinking about it and so on. Empty or signative intendings, of course, constitute the largest class of our conscious acts, and, from the beginning of his career, Husserl had been fascinated as to how these kinds of intentions can function as knowledge. Husserl's interest in the manner in which meaning is expressed in different acts leads him to revise the account of meaning as species which was employed in the earlier investigations. I can utter different sentences with different senses or meanings based on the same act of perceiving, Lee 6:4. Furthermore, a listener can understand the meaning with enacting the act of perception or indeed re-enacting it in imagination. The listener can understand it as a report of the act of perceiving, i.e., he says that he sees a blackbird. In the expression I see a blackbird, the sense or meaning of that expression is not carried by the perceptual act alone. For Husserl, the sense of the statement can survive the elimination of the act of perception. In other words, I do not have actually to enact the act of seeing to grasp the meaning of the statement. The act of perception somehow anchors the meaning but does not embody it completely. This leads Husserl to revise his earlier discussion of essentially occasional expressions. 5. Recognizing that meaning is not simply instantiated in an act, but that the act has its own specific form of intending where the meaning appears with its own mode of givenness which the instantiation model did not adequately handle. According to Kant, our experience has two components, a receptive element of sensory intuition and an element of reflective conceptuality, which Kant calls spontaneity. But Kant explicitly denied that humans had the capacity to intuit concepts. Husserl agrees with Kant concerning the sensory matter of most of our concepts, but holds that in higher order intuitions we do have the capacity to intuit ideal categorial entities, from the mixed category of the concept of color, to pure categories, and at the highest level, logical categories such as unity, plurality and existence. Husserl treats categorial intuition, categorie Landscoring, as akin to a kind of perception. The first attempt to express it comes in the second section of the sixth investigation entitled Sense and Understanding, 40-66. Categorial intuition involves a broadening of the concepts of perception and intuition. According to Husserl, my intuition of a state of affairs, Sackler-Holt, for example, I see that the paper is white, involves categorial intuition, a complex intuition that something is the case. In a judgment of this kind I intuit what is going on, as it were. How is this being the case intuited? Husserl agrees with Kant that being is not a predicate, that is, that the existing situation is not a property of the individual object, the white paper. Saying that something is does not give us an intuition of a new property in a manner similar to learning something is red. But this shows for Husserl that assertion of the category of being does not involve grasping a property or the object itself. Nor does it emerge from reflecting on the act of consciousness as some had thought, rather the categorial structure belongs to the ideal structure of the object, to the objectivity as such. Categorial acts yield up the grasp of the pure categorial concepts, if, then, and, or and so on, which have no correlates in the objects of the perceptual acts themselves. For Husserl, moreover, categorial acts are founded on the sensory acts of perceiving, but do not reduce to them. For Husserl, categorial acts grasp states of affairs and in fact constitute them in the very categorial act. Thus it is not the case that I grasp sensuously the components of the judgment and synthesize them using some kind of subjective rules of the understanding as Kant suggests, according to Husserl's interpretation, rather we apprehend the state of affairs of which the non-sensuous categorial elements are necessary constituents. In the course of this complex investigation Husserl outlines a new conception of truth, rethinking the classical correspondence account. It was this discussion of truth which attracted the interest of Heidegger and others, for example, Ernst Tugendhat did, but unfortunately we cannot treat it further here. The influence of the logical investigations although, as the young Heidegger recognized, the logical investigations did not have an immediate impact on mainstream philosophy in Germany, within a decade it was recognized as a major philosophical achievement by leading figures such as Paul Natorp, Wilhelm Dilthey, Wilhelm Wundt and Heinrich Rickert. 75 Husserl suspected that much of Meinong's work after 1901 owed a direct, but unacknowledged, debt to the investigations, but Brentano ignored the work. In particular, the Prolegomena was credited with refuting psychologism. In a 1905 study, the elder statesman of German philosophy, Wilhelm Dilthey praised Husserl's investigations as epoch-making for its use of description in epistemology. 76 The psychologist Wilhelm Wundt, too, accepted the Prolegomena's arguments against psychologism, but criticized Husserl's second volume as proposing an extreme logicism and demanding a complete reform of psychology. Husserl rejected Wundt's criticism as a complete misunderstanding of the work, saying he neither advocated logicism, in Wundt's sense, nor said a word about the reform of psychology. 77 In line with the Neo-Kantian tradition in general, Paul Natorp had been an early critic of psychologism. Indeed, Husserl had written to Natorp in 1897 announcing that he was working on a book to dispel the subjective psychologizing tendency from logic. Natorp reviewed the Prolegomena favorably in Kantstudien in 1901, portraying Husserl as broadening the essentially Kantian inquiry into the necessary conditions of the possibility of experience. 78 Natorp predicted that Husserl would move towards Kant as he came to overcome his naive opposition between the empirical psychological realm and the realm of abstract idealities. 79 Husserl, however, always kept his distance from Neo-Kantianism, claiming that phenomenology was more radical. As we have seen, in his Göttingen years, 1901–16, Husserl attracted many brilliant students, for example, Johannes Dorbert, 1877–1947, Moritz Geiger, 1880–1937, Adolf Reinach, 1883–1917, Max Scheler, 1874–1928, Hedwig Conrad Martius, 1888–1966, Roman Ungerden and Edith Stein, all drawn to Husserl's new way of approaching logical and epistemological problems which broke with the tradition. Around 1909, the young Freiburg seminarian Martin Heidegger encountered the logical investigations and pored over the work without being certain what it was that fascinated him. He later recalled, both volumes of Husserl's logical investigations lay on my desk in the theological seminary ever since my first semester there. I had learned from many references in philosophical periodicals that Husserl's thought was determined by Franz Brentano. From Husserl's logical investigations, I expected a decisive aid in the questions stimulated by Brentano's dissertation. 81 Heidegger himself initially began reading Husserl to understand Brentano's account of the nature of being and was drawn especially to the fifth and sixth investigations, especially Husserl's original accounts of categorial intuition and of truth. Heidegger saw in Husserl's account of categorial intuition not only a method for articulating the nature of the existential judgment but also the basis of a new way of thinking about the notion of truth and the meaning of being. Heidegger went on to read the investigations in the seminars of Heinrich Rickert and Emil Lask, a young scholar who also worked on categorial intuition. Heidegger discussed the logical investigations in one of his first publications, a review of recent logical research published in 1912, where he recognizes that Husserl had drawn out the theoretic incoherence of psychologism and its relativistic consequences. For Heidegger, Husserl had not only enlarged the scope of logic, but had made central the problematics of judgment and the nature of evidence. 82 Indeed, it was Heidegger who, as Husserl's assistant at Freiburg from 1919, repeatedly urged Husserl to reprint the sixth investigation, to which Husserl finally agreed in 1920. News of the logical investigations spread outside Germany also, being translated into Russian as early as 1909, which version had a major influence on Roman Jakobson's conception of a formal science of language. Through Roman Ungerden, who reviewed it in Polish, the investigations played an important role in Polish philosophy, influencing Stanislaw Lesniewski's development of mereology, for instance. It was translated into Spanish in 1929. A French translation of the second edition appeared in 3 volumes between 1959 and 1963–83, but Husserl's influence on French philosophy had begun much earlier through the efforts of his earlier Göttingen students, Jean Heering, and later through the writings of Emmanuel Levinas, Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Paul Ricoeur and Jacques Derrida, all of whom began their philosophical careers with critical studies of Husserl. Derrida, for instance, has acknowledged that his whole philosophical impetus arises out of his studies on Husserl, for example, his study of Husserl's concept of Genesis, written as a part of his doctoral research project in 1953–4. 84 Since the publication of Derrida's influential interpretations and critique of Husserl's account of signs in the first investigation, an argument has raged as to whether Derrida has misinterpreted, even willfully distorted, Husserl's account. 85 During his Freiburg years, 1916–38, Husserl became a philosopher of international renown, in contact with prominent philosophers of his day, including Ernst Cassirer, Bertrand Russell, Rudolf Carnap, Charles Hartshorne and William Neal, among others. Among his own brilliant Freiburg students were Oskar Becker, 1889–1964, and Fritz Kaufmann, 1891–1958. Husserl's phenomenology also had a stimulating influence on philosophers who later came to be associated with the Frankfurt School, including Herbert Marcus, Hannah Arendt, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, the latter of whom both wrote dissertations on Husserl. Husserl of course has been a major influence on both Ernst Tugendhat and Carl Otto Appel's philosophies of language, and his work in the investigations has been compared with the equally original breakthroughs of Ludwig Wittgenstein. In contrast to the situation in continental Europe, the logical investigations were somewhat slower to gain recognition in the English-speaking world. Bertrand Russell wrote to Husserl on the 19th of April, 1920 saying that he had taken a copy of his logical investigations with him to jail, with the intent of reviewing it for mind, but the review never appeared. However, in 1924, Russell recognized the logical investigations as a monumental work, listing it alongside his own Principles of Mathematics, 1903, and works by William James, Fritsch and G. E. Moore, who, incidentally, also admired Husserl's book, 86 for their efforts in the refutation of German idealism. 87 Indeed, as Findlay noted, the logical investigations have much in common with the practice of philosophy as understood by Bertrand Russell. Richard Rorty in his Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature has remarked, Russell joined Husserl in denouncing the psychologism which had infected the philosophy of mathematics, and announced that logic was the essence of philosophy. 88 Indeed, one can find many themes in the logical investigations which are also treated in analytic philosophy. For example, Husserl offers his own version of a solution to the problem of definite descriptions, famously treated by Russell. 89 Husserl himself visited England in 1922 intent on establishing relations with English philosophers, Husserl being the first German philosopher to visit England since the Great War. He delivered a number of lectures which were attended by Gilbert Ryle among others, but the lectures were not a success, despite his meeting well-known figures such as Broad, Stout and G. Dawes Hicks. The logical investigations has been discussed in relation to the history of analytic philosophy by Michael Dummett, David Bell and others. 90 The logician Kurt Gödel studied the logical investigations after 1959 and was especially impressed by the treatment of categorial intuition in the sixth investigation which he recommended to other logicians. 91 The contemporary relevance of the logical investigations. The six investigations stand as a vast resource of philosophical ideas, some tentatively sketched, others more confidently laid out. Of primary significance are Husserl's discussions of the meanings of key philosophical terms. He carefully differentiates between logical and psychological content, empty and filled intuitions, the difference between generalization and formalization, the meanings of signification and reference, the nature of nominal and categorial acts, and so on. Husserl's Prolegomena is still of interest for its original conception of the nature and scope of pure logic and its discussion of the self-refuting character of psychologism, relativism, including anthropologism. Husserl's critique of psychologism later expanded to a wide-ranging critique of naturalism, specifically the naturalization of consciousness, in his 1911 essay Philosophy as a Rigorous Science, and these antinaturalist arguments are still relevant to the contemporary debate between naturalists, for example, Quinn, Dennett, Churchland, and antinaturalists, for example, Hilary Putnam, John McDowell, Robert Grandin. Indeed, Putnam regularly cites Husserl's critique of naturalism, especially as formulated in The Crisis, but which has its origins in the investigations. The investigations are an important resource for discussions of consciousness and other issues discussed in contemporary philosophy of mind. In particular, Husserl's account of intentionality in the fifth investigation has been hugely influential, but his views on the nature of perceptual content are also important and relevant to the work of Peacock and others. Husserl has been seen as a strong defender of the subjective point of view and the ineliminability of consciousness from any full account of the nature of knowledge, themes which have more recently been treated by John Searle, Colin McGinn, Thomas Nagel and others. 92 Indeed, John Searle's account of intentionality strongly resembles Husserl's, although Searle himself denies any direct influence. Other contemporary philosophers, for example, Peter Simons, Barry Smith, Kevin Mulligan, are interested in developing more precisely the formal ontology or descriptive metaphysics of the investigations. The investigations are also of crucial interest as a source text for anyone wishing to understand the nature of phenomenology as it was developed both by Husserl and by his followers. Heidegger's phenomenological writings of the period between 1919 and 1928 would not be comprehensible without a thorough understanding of Husserl's breakthrough work. As the meaning of the phenomenological tradition comes once more to be interrogated, a return to the investigations to attempt to understand the precise nature of the phenomenology that appeared therein seems inevitable. John N. Findlay's translation. Finally, some words on the present translation. The publication of J. N. Findlay's translation of the investigations helped to correct a view of Husserl which, up to 1970, had been based primarily on the availability of Gibson's translation of ideas. I. Findlay has produced a powerful and much admired translation, based on the second edition. In keeping with the nature of that edition, he does not usually indicate where the text departs from the first edition. It is important to bear in mind that this, and subsequent editions up to the fourth, were the ones Husserl himself authorized, and a critical edition did not appear in the Husserlian series until 1984, and thus was not available to Findlay. 93 Inevitably, given both the size of the book and the need to find suitable English terms to render Husserl's many technical distinctions and innovations, Findlay's translation has its limitations. There is some sloppiness, with words, phrases, and even whole sentences being omitted. Some footnotes have been dropped, for example, Lee 410, who are 19/1, 328, while others are incorporated into the main text. There are some unhappy construals, hold as substance rather than content, some misunderstandings, for example, Ein Waltz rendered as tour de force rather than act of violence, who are 13, but in the main, the translation is serviceable and the prose smooth, clear, even elegant. While a new translation is certainly desirable, it will take some years, and in the meantime, students of Husserl need something in their hands right now. Given the limitations of a reprint of this kind, I have corrected only the more egregious errors, and do not claim to have identified them all. Although not all agreed with the project of reprinting Findlay, nevertheless I must record my gratitude to the following Husserl scholars for their assistance: Rudolf Burnett, Ian Line, Sebastian Laft, Ulrich Mell, Kevin Mulligan, Carl Scaman, Peter Simons, Claire Ortiz Hill and Don Welton.